Hello, everybody. Happy Friday. Thanks for coming by to the Friday conversation. I want to thank everyone for stopping by. And before we start, just want to say Taylor wasn't feeling well tonight, so she won't be able to join us. So hopefully she feels better. And I think she's going to try and pop in the chat. So, and also, before we get started, Mr. P.L. Stewart's here. I wanted to just congratulate him on the birth of his grandson born this week. So
Thank you very much.
P.L.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, Jolien, you want to kick us off with some introductions?
Hi everyone, I am Jolien. I have a small booktube channel, Jolien Reads, and I read a lot of fantasy, mostly together with Steve actually. He always recommends me books. He just got me this one, actually. So I am going to read this one soon. I'm very
my
excited.
goodness.
I heard a lot of great things, so
Oh,
I really can't wait.
Oh, wow. Jolie, I'm so honored. AP, I knew AP had ordered them, but Jolene, I had no idea. Thank you. I'm humbled. And thank you, AP. Of course. Oh, you got both. Thank you. I'm very honored. Hello, everyone. I'm honored.
So yeah, Steve, thanks for having me.
Hi, I'm AP. My YouTube channel is A Critical Dragon, and I typically talk about narrative elements in films, television, and in books, and I have a tendency to focus on fantasy. And I also got PL's books recently just because he was talking about them. They seemed interesting. So at some point I'll get around to reading them. And we'll do the typical new... I've discovered this is the new way to review books on YouTube. Yeah, that's definitely a very good book. Highly recommend.
And Dave and Olive.
Oh, Dave's on mute.
You're on mute, Dave. There you go.
All right, you guys got to keep me on here. Okay, so I'm Dave, and this is Olive. We have a booktube channel called Book Blather, and we review some new books, but we started reading. Become avid readers pretty late in life, so a lot of the books we review are not current, and we review stuff. We like horror, sci-fi, fantasy, but we review all types of fiction, nonfiction.
And of course, PL.
And we know it wasn't all of the press the mute button on Dave. It's just totally Dave's issue. PL Stuart, author of John Kingdom, also with Steve, a blogger for Before We Go blogs. So love talking about books, literature. Again, so honored that AP Canada, Jolene, and Steve have my books, and I feel very, very humbled. Happy to be here. And most people look forward to Steve's Friday conversation, whether they're part of it or they're joining the chat. So I'm honored to be here live.
Of course. So I wanted to ask all of you, the new trailer for the new Dungeons and Dragons movie came out, and AP, I think you're the perfect person to ask. What your thoughts were on this one?
Well, I'm curious. They went with is it Chris Pine? I always forget which Chris it is, but Chris Pine is edging the bard. So is he going to polish his paladin, maybe bash his barbarian, and whether or not that's going to change the rating from PG-13 to an R? Sorry, to be honest, I'm really sorry. I'm really excited about the film because I love. There are different ways of approaching fantasy, and you can have something like A Song of Ice and Fire, like a Game of Thrones, which is very super serious, trying to really ground it in a gritty medieval reality. Or you have a celebration of it just being an explosion of fantasy, of really cool things and spells going everywhere. There's an entire range of what fantasy is. And I think we've had a tendency, because the TV show of Game of Thrones was so successful, to go, that's where we're going to go with this. Go grittier, go darker, get down into the dirt, make it as realistic and as close to medievalism as possible. And you go, or we had someone turning into an owl bear. Like, how can you not think that that's really cool? And it's part of what we love about fantasy, even if an owl bear is a monstrosity and not a creature that you're really allowed to turn into. But a DM can make a ruling at the table. And Albuquerque's fine then.
What did you think, Jolien? Did you catch the trailer?
I actually haven't watched it yet, but I'm always behind on everything that goes on TV, movies, TV shows. I usually watch them like 2 years after everybody else have watched them. So, but I'm probably going to watch it because there's not really a lot of fantasy on TV. It's getting a bit more and more. But if there's something coming out, I'm always hopeful that I am going to like it.
Dave, did you catch it?
Yeah, I saw it once really quick, and yeah, I'm excited to watch. I don't know who here is old enough to have watched the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon on Saturday mornings, but
No, Dave, just to interrupt you.
yeah,
Didn't you always want to have that bow? It was the bow was the thing that everyone wanted.
yeah. Yeah, that brings back a lot of memories, And we were talking about this, I think, last week a little bit. Wasn't it last week we were talking about
D&D?
Playing D&D back in the day, and yeah, I'm glad it's still hip these days. I think I was telling the story last week or two ago, whatever, that I have a daughter. One of my daughters just graduated college, and she was in a suite with 7 other girls. They had these eight girl suites at the college, and I was pretty surprised to find out that they got my daughter into playing Dungeons and Dragons in the suite. Like, all these girls played it, and I don't know why, but that just surprised me that was still a hip thing to do these days. And they called it Dungeons and Daddies, not Dungeons and Dragons, but
Dungeons and Daddies. That doesn't sound like that sounds like something totally different.
Yeah.
Than that.
Are you sure
that was the name of their, like. Sorry.
Are you sure it was the same game?
Yeah. It was the same game. It wasn't actually quite the same game that we used to play, because when I brought my daughter back from one of the breaks, there was a girl there that was like the ringleader. She must have been the DM, and so I tried. I was trying to be the cool dad, and I tried to start talking to her about D&D, and I'm like, "Oh, you guys play basic D&D or AD&D or which?" And I didn't realize I had gone like way beyond that. These days they're on like the fifth generation of Dungeons and Dragons. So my attempt to be the cool dad was very short lived. But yeah, no, it was that was their little text group name for it. But it was it was Dungeons and Dragons. A couple of them I think actually would dress up even on the weekends when they would play, when they run these campaigns.
Once again, have to ask: are you sure they were playing Dungeons and Dragons? But it starts with playing Dungeons and Dragons, and the next thing you know, they're successful playwrights and authors and screenplay writers.
Yeah,
it can go anywhere. It's a terrible game to get people invested in.
Yeah. Well, it shouldn't be surprising, actually, because that's what these girls were. She goes to Emerson, which is a big publishing and art school, and so all these girls were they were all like publishing, literature and publishing majors. So. I guess shouldn't be surprised that all those creative minds are into Dungeons and Dragons. But
and Dave, you turned Drew onto book darts.
Oh yeah,
yeah. I got some book darts last week after Dave mentioned them. I love them. Definitely the best way to mark things in books.
Yeah.
What
about you, PL? Did you catch that trailer?
Yeah, I did catch it, but I mean, when we consider lit RPG and the explosion of lit RPG specifically, I think Philip Chase reviewed Jeff Speet. I want to pronounce his name properly. Okay, sorry, he said it's like an 8. Okay, sorry about that, Jeff, if you're watching. Jeff Speet, his book Pound and Unbound, and I believe that's essentially that type of based off of the Dungeons and Dragons kind of lit RPG stuff, and it seems like Phil really enjoyed it. So it's so when we consider the genesis, like how the two are interrelated now, and this explosion of lit RPG books and doing really well, that's I guess it's no surprise that people are still playing D&D today. So
that was a lot of what I've heard about it was negative, but when I watched it, it seemed like goofy fun. I don't know. I wondered what the reaction would have been if it didn't have Dungeons and Dragons in the title. If it had just been a fun fantasy movie, I think people would have, the reception might have been different.
Well, again, I think there's a thing about expectations in terms of what is going to be cool in fantasy. And, certain people have a very clear idea in their head what they want. And that's brilliant. That's fantastic to know what it is that you want. But then there's some of the rest of us who love the sheer variety that you get in the fantasy genre, like where an author's imagination is the limitation that is being applied. Well, that and the ability to communicate that imagination. But something like D&D, if you think Andre Norton did the very first D&D based novel back in, was it 77, 79? Because it was it was Quad Keep. And then you had the Forgotten Realms books, you had the Dragonlance books, and they have carried on going. You had the Choose Your Own Adventure books, Warlock on Firetop Mountain or something. Those Steve Jackson Choose Your Own Adventure books. And we had this whole explosion in the 80s and 90s, and it is carried on, of lots of different types of fantasy. The Ravenloft books, Pathfinder, the White Wolf series. There's so many different things. Vampire the Masquerade, and what was the werewolf? There was a werewolf one as well. But we have this whole range of what fantasy can be, and to go, no, it must be only this. I think it's a massive limitation. But I can understand someone who goes, but that's what I really want. You go, that is brilliant. But I think there's room in the genre, and there's room in film adaptation and in film and television to have an entire range of different types of fantasy being shown. You look at a film like Stardust, and it is a fantasy film. It's a fairy tale and fairy tale inspired, and it's young adult. There are lots of different elements to it that we can isolate, but fundamentally, it is a fantasy film, and there's plenty of room for something like Stardust and Game of Thrones and Dungeons and Dragons. That we have loads of stuff that we can have. So I'm excited about more fantasy, because the more fantasy that we have and all of these different types and things being exciting and exciting different people, it will generate A, more mainstream awareness, B, more mainstream acceptance. It'll encourage other writers, it'll encourage other filmmakers, it'll encourage studio execs who go, oh, it might be expensive to make, but we're going to make our money back. And the next project they pick might be something that we really deeply care about. And so as a fan of the genre, I like seeing lots of different ways to explore what the genre can do in the different media formats.
And Nathaniel had a comment. Contemporary D&D is more acting improv than the game originally designed. Tim Casks, who edited TSR, notes how the narration of tactics had disappeared.
It's a shame that it takes so long for Hollywood to catch up and adapt some of these books and turn them into movies, especially in fantasy, because there's a lot of beloved series out there. I mean, they're now getting to, after Peter Jackson's original Lord of the Rings, now they're getting to, pre Lord of the Rings with the Silmarillion type fare in the new upcoming, I guess is it Disney or Amazon Prime, whatever the new Lord of the Rings is. They've got to The Witcher now. Now we're going, we didn't get enough of JRM, so now we're going to Fire and Blood and taking that era of his world, and we're doing, a House of the Dragon, and but it's a shame that it, with rights and negotiating international rights and movie rights and all these things, that it takes so long to get to some of these series to see them on the screen, because I'm sure we can all name a dozen great fantasy series that we'd love to see adapted to the big or the small screen that are out there, that we're just hoping, oh, wouldn't it be cool to have, this on but we have to wait for, somebody to get the rights from the author, and, it's so, yeah, but it is exciting, as AP said. It is very exciting.
I'm still waiting for them to make the live action Dragonlance film.
One of the things that I remember when I first read the Dragonlance book is in the opening sequence. Tanis half-elven pulls his bow, draws back an arrow, looses the arrow. I shouldn't say fires the arrow, looses the arrow, and misses. And I think that was the first time I'd ever heard of an archer in a fantasy novel actually missing, because everyone had modeled their archers in fantasy on Legolas, who never missed a shot ever. And so it was this whole, he draws back, he aims, he looses, and it misses. And I went, oh, well, this is going to be an interesting book.
I discovered a couple years ago that there's actually, which I had never known, there was actually an animated movie for Dragonlance. I found it on YouTube one day. But
yeah. Mm-hmm. For those people who are always and absolutely convinced that animation is the best way to go for any fantasy adaptation, the Dragonlance animation and the Earthsea animations and the Rankin Bass animation of the Lord of the Rings, although I actually quite like the Bakshi animation of the Lord of the Rings, I have a major soft spot in my heart for that one. But sometimes when you look at the animations, you go, you know what, maybe a live action might be better than this. And a lot of it depends on aesthetics, and a lot of it depends on what it is that you like. But animation is not necessarily the silver bullet or the golden ticket to getting fantasy right. And there are examples out there where it hasn't necessarily quite hit the mark, hit the target, or been in the same arena as the target.
I can't remember if it was the Bakshi version of the animation. One of them just reminds me of He-Man. Like every time I see that in my head, I can't get He-Man out of my, it just the comparison. I don't remember which one it was.
But it's weird. Like if you watch the Bakshi Lord of the Rings, and then you watch Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, it's astounding the number of, that's a coincidental shot. It looks very similar. And everyone talked about Jackson's vision of this thing. And you go, he got his vision from Bakshi. He just, wasn't quite as insane as Bakshi.
So what's your favorite, AP, what's your favorite animated fantasy?
Well, apart from Bakshi's Lord of the Rings, I suppose Arcane was actually quite good. I really liked Arcane, and it showed what you could do with a lot of time and money, and also basically having notes for backstory, but no story written, so you could construct a story to fit the medium that you're telling the story in. So they weren't beholden to, this is how the story must go. They had bits and pieces, and they go, right, we can now turn it into a cohesive narrative, and we'll break it up into these sections. So structurally, they could make it work for the animation. And it really was quite beautiful. The Witcher, what was it? Something about the wolf, and it was the backstory for Vesemir. That was on Netflix. And that was, again, you could see a lot of the movements in it inspired by Japanese anime, because he does, at one point, he does this backflip, like 30 feet in the air and 40 feet backwards to land on a branch. And you go, I know the Witchers are good. They're not quite that good. But again, that was quite interesting. Castlevania, I didn't particularly like, because I'm not a huge fan of that style of animation, but they had some spectacular shots in it. There were some really wonderful things that they did at certain points, but overall wasn't a huge fan. But then I would go back to a lot more of the science fictional stuff that I was a big fan of, like Akira and Ghost in the Shell. Not so much Urusaka Doji. That was a misstep on my part, not understanding what type of animation that was. And I liked a lot of the Studio Ghibli stuff. Even the, like, Howl's Moving Castle, which was so radically different from the book, which I had loved. But the Howl's Moving Castle adaptation was a wonderful adaptation and did something completely different. It just wasn't the book. And that was fine. It was a different way of interpreting. It's a new story that they were telling, and I enjoyed a lot of that. But those would be, I think, the main ones that came up. Oh, and Brave. the was it Pixar or
Yeah.
I can't remember if it was Pixar did Brave, but I loved that one. That was a fantastic one.
So, Jolien, if you could choose one fantasy series to be adapted, what would it be? Anyone you want. What would you pick?
I actually think maybe Raven's Shadow. Still need to finish the last book. I've been working on it. I have read one chapter in July, so it's happening. But I think it's a good one because it's lower in fantasy. So I think that it would be easier to do it right in comparison to something like Stormlight Archive or something with a lot more fantasy and a lot more special effects and stuff like that. Usually I don't like it when it looks cheap. And even when a lot of other people say that it looks fine, it very easily looks cheap for me. So I'm always a little bit wary when there's a lot of magic systems and all of that. And in Bloodsong, you don't have that. So I think that one would work well for me.
Could you make Malazan into
Be a long series.
pick your adaptation? Like, could you make Malazan into, because, and again, I am not the Malazan expert here. I defer to people like AP and Jolien and Steve. I'm not sure if you've read it, Dave, but
22 minutes before we hit Malazan.
I know it didn't take long. Okay, blame me. I brought it
bring
there.
it up. I didn't bring it up.
That's true.
Nothing from my mouth.
It's a subliminal. He's got it. AP's got the book staring at me. I can't help it. It's a subliminal advertising. But really, what, like, could you? I've only read the first book. Could you make it? How would you do it? Like, what do you think, folks? Like,
Yeah.
Does anyone else want to
take?
take a swing at this before I do?
I'd say you'd have to. I think there'd have to be a lot of changes to make it to adapt it. I think you'd have to change the storylines around a little bit and obviously AP would be the best person to answer this. But I think because there's so many points of view changes so often, you would have to have different storylines going at different times. So that would be. I think you'd have to stretch it out too. So like Guardians of the Moon would probably be a season on its own, of a 10-episode season, I would imagine.
Yeah, and as a Malazan novice, before we hear from the expert, I think the other major problem is that. So I read Gardens of the Moon, and I made it through 2/3 of Deadhouse Gates, and like I said before, so AP, I put it aside, intending to go back once I have some more experience in epic fantasy. I'm going to go back to it, but I think another major problem with adapting that would be, which I think Malazan is by design this way, is that there is no. I don't know how this would work for a movie or a TV show because there is no buildup, right? Like Erickson purposely drops you right into the middle of it, with everything already going on. There's no build up or lead up like you have in your traditional story where you're learning about your main protagonist or hero or whatever. And so that seems to me would be very hard to do it. You'd have to make significant changes, I would think, if you were going to try to adapt that. But
well, Dave, quick question then. Where's the build up to introduce who Hamlet is and what's going on in Hamlet in that traditional story that is a ghost story? It opens in media res. Macbeth essentially opens in media res. So opening in media res is not a new thing. And it is actually incredibly common in traditional storytelling. It's just not as common in modern fantasy writing. So opening in media res is not an issue. Iron Man. In the Iron Man movie, the very first Iron Man with Robert Downey Jr., what happens in it? You start off and he's in demonstrating the thing in the desert. They go along, there's the explosion, and then you go back in time. There's an ellipsis, a flashback, and the character is introduced. So there are 101 different ways that you can approach something like that, because the introduction for Tony Stark is really, we show him in his best light, something bad happens, and then we go back and show what an a-hole he is. Because like when we see him in the casino and stuff like that, he is not sympathetic. He is rude to his friend. He stands people up. He's dismissive of his friend. He's a womanizer. He treats women badly. you know, we see if it had opened with that, it's incredibly difficult to make him sympathetic. So they opened with him being funny and doing a presentation, and then joking around with the soldiers in the Humvee, and then something bad happening, because that makes us identify with him more. And then they go back in time and show us what he's really like. So opening in media res is not an issue. Even like things like the Witcher, you don't have to go back to, and this is who the character is. We get filled in on Geralt's backstory as The Witcher develops. We get filled in on Yennefer's backstory as The Witcher develops. You don't need always to go back to the very, very start. And I think to assume that about viewers or readers is a massive disservice to how smart viewers and readers actually are. I think people can follow things when they aren't necessarily introduced at the very beginning. But that's one minor point. But the points that would make Malazan difficult to adapt, in terms of the special effects for some of the battles and some of the magic and some of the races, that is special effects intensive. So either you're talking about a lot of CGI or a lot of people in prosthetics, and that immediately shoots up your budget for live action. In terms of structure, the majority of Gardens of the Moon, the Darujhistan sequence, is basically the Three Musketeers. So, like, we know that can be done. And, you know, if you were telling the Three Musketeers story and you go, this point of view is with Athos, then this point of view is with Aramis, you can actually just set the camera back and, you know, shoot that person, shoot that person. You don't have to attach the camera to the narrative POV of a chapter. That's not necessary, because you can choose a new narrative form for a filmic adaptation. You don't have to be beholden to the POV that is in the chapter. There would be, I think, if you were doing live action, you would quite possibly go, right, how much of, say, the Malazan Book of the Fallen are we going to do? Because if you're going to do all 10 books, you go, okay, how are we going to film this? Because this actor we want for 5 years, or this actor we want for 10 years. That suddenly you get into the practicalities of locking in an actor to play a character all the way through the series. And that is an issue with live action, particularly with people aging, and you're going to be planning this big whole series. And that is a huge amount of money up front. So again, money is going to be a big issue. If you do it with animation, voice actors, and that's much easier to do. The characters aren't aging. You can create the digital character and it's fine, or the CGI character, and put it in the animation. But in terms of structure, there are multiple ways that you can do this, because you can think of the Malazan Book of the Fallen as essentially in 3 geographical arenas. And you go, okay, so we can focus on one for one season, then one for the next season. Or you go, okay, we're going to intercut across them. So that's one way of doing it. You can actually split it up according to geography and start building and moving with that in mind. Or you can pick out core characters and go, right, we're going to follow this character from the beginning, this character from the beginning, and this character from the beginning. And, you know, story is when all of the narrative events are rearranged chronologically. Plot are the narrative events as we encounter them in the narrative. So you can take the story of the Malazan Book of the Fallen and reorganize it into a different plot. And so that's how you can divide it up. And then you have to make a decision as to whether or not, is it going to be a TV show? And if it's a TV show, do we get 10 45-minute episodes? Are you getting 20 35-minute episodes? Are you getting 8 hour-long episodes? Because each of those is going to change the structure of where you have climaxes and conclusions, and where you have ramping tension and the building towards tension, and where you have to have quiet moments. That all will change according to the structure of the actual narrative that you're telling. So there are, and I have, with various other people, worked out different ways to adapt the Malazan Book of the Fallen depending on what it is that people wanted to do. Because if you turn it into films, you could just take the Darujhistan section of Gardens of the Moon and go, we're going to do the Darujhistan section. You could take from Deadhouse Gates the Chain of Dogs section and go, we're just going to do a Chain of Dogs film. But if you were doing that, then you'd still have to substantially change it in order to have the same movement, change of pace, change of ethos and pathos and bathos all the way through it, to have humor injected at different points. What character points of view are going to bring in to change it around? Because one of the reasons it works in Deadhouse Gates is you're interchanging with different narrative threads, with different POVs and different storylines that are giving different emotional beats that contrast with the chain of dogs that runs through it. So you can't just lift it out wholesale, film it, and go, oh yeah, it'll be fine. You would still have to think about it as a cohesive narrative, and then work out where your peaks and troughs of emotion are, where your peaks and troughs of action are, what character focus you're going to bring in, what POVs you're going to use, and what story you are going to tell.
So you've worked on that.
A little bit.
A little bit. Okay.
A little tiny bit.
No, I never really considered the length of each episode. That makes a lot of sense. It's something you don't really think about until you probably dig into it. But the ramping tension and how to, the way you structure it would depend on the length of each episode if it is a TV series. So that's interesting. Nick's assortment of Miscellany had a comment tangentially related to the RPG books, or the many Warhammer books, which Adrian Tchaikovsky wrote one of. He writes short stories for them quite regularly.
Huh.
And our friend Derry had a comment. I agree, AP, for all of our sense of ownership for these titles, the acting of telling, changing, and altering stories. It's part of who we are as Terry Pratchett's storytelling apes.
Well, it's interesting. Like I know that a lot of people have been talking about adaptation, something I harp on about all the time. But when you think back to how we used to discuss adaptation maybe 20 years ago, and they made the film Clueless, which is an adaptation of Jane Austen's Emma, and they made Cruel Intentions, which was an adaptation of Les Liaisons Dangereuses. So it was an 18th century French epistolary novel adapted into a late 20th century high school in Manhattan elite sort of boarding school. And we watched those and went, these are great, and we recognize the original story in them. You go, these are fantastic. And now it's, the elves have the wrong length of hair.
Yeah.
What happened to the understanding of adaptation that we have gone from an 18th century epistolary novel set before the French Revolution is adapted into a modern day Manhattan elite high school, and we go, that's a fantastic adaptation. That person should have a beard, and that's breaking the lore that the female dwarves don't have beards. And you go, but hang on, in the Peter Jackson adaptations, Aragorn had a beard and he shouldn't have. He's incapable of growing one because of his elvish heritage. I don't see you burning down the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Talking about adaptation these days, it gets me a little hot under the collar sometimes.
Eric had a question, or why they have never made anything, made a 40K anything yet.
Ask Creative Assembly. They are very, very protective of their IP. They have done a lot of adaptations, just not filmic ones. Think of the number of games that they produce. Those are all adaptations of various parts of their storylines. And they have tried to launch. I remember in high school, they were raising money to launch a big Space Marine film, and then it all fell flat in its face. But the 40K stuff and the Warhammer Fantasy Battle, if you think of how rabid certain aspects of various fandoms are, now imagine the 40K crowd. If you didn't get the right epaulette on the side of that one Marine's arm, or he has the wrong knee pads. I wouldn't touch that adaptation with a barge pole.
I want to ask all of you about fandoms here in a minute, just since it came up. But Nathaniel had a question. Even though there are books drawn from games, visual media seems to be more of a stretch. I suspect that the granted works against a satisfying adaptation. I did want to ask about, and we mentioned adaptations and kind of nitpicking little details, but I wonder how much groups of fandom. I wonder how much that changes adaptations or adaptations that maybe are passed on because of certain fandoms.
I mean, I know that I am extremely excited for. I see Jolene's got her copy back there. I'm extremely excited for House of the Dragon, and I believe that obviously there's very few franchises that are other than maybe. I mean, Star Wars, Star Trek, different platform, but the Game of Thrones fandom, they're going to burn the place down if House of the Dragon doesn't live up to,
Yeah.
they're looking for redemption from the way GOT finished. So I'm most curious to see how that turns out. But I believe that fandom is really gonna decide the fate of whether that series is successful or not. So not the casual viewer turning to go, oh, okay, well, no, it's gonna be the fandom. And some of them may have their copies of Fire and Blood there,
Yeah.
looking to see, as AP indicated, for the authenticity of, whether Damon's hair was parted the right way, or do you know what I mean? So, yeah, I think
Exactly. I think that for some people it's almost like a test if you're a true fan. If you can see all of the mistakes and then point them out and this is different, so it's not valid. While I always look at an adaptation, I look at it completely separate from the books. So usually I like them, like The Witcher. I thought that it was fine. Towards the end, I didn't like the story that much of season 2, but that wasn't because it was different from the books. I just wasn't really engaged. Game of Thrones, like unpopular opinion, I didn't hate the ending. It would have it needed probably an extra season. It could have been handled better, but the ending in itself, it's still better than a lot of other shows that we see. In comparison to the earlier seasons, yeah, it wasn't that good. But in comparison to TV shows in general, I didn't hate it that much. And I think that just a lot of people were a little bit salty that George R. R. Martin hasn't finished the books yet. So they were probably going to be pretty negative. Whatever happened, they had a very high bar. And I don't think that that's fair going into an adaptation with a negative mindset. Then maybe it's better to not watch. And that's what I'm also seeing for this one. People are almost surprised that the trailer is not total trash. And that's not how you should go into something like this.
Well, obviously, I'm gonna have to cancel the video I had uploaded for Monday because I'm talking about all of this stuff. But adaptations in the relationship to fandom, it's weird. I mean, when you think of like in the UK, Doctor Who fandom, very passionate fandom about Doctor Who, and when a new Doctor gets announced, invariably part of the fandom will be outraged because that's not their Doctor, and another part of the fandom will be really happy going, oh, this is going to be interesting. And there will always be splits over, oh, well, you've changed that aspect of the lore, or that contradicts that canonical episode. And we've become very tyrannical with the application of an adaptation must be absolutely true to every rule that has ever been established and every fact that has ever been uttered in a text, even when authors are contradictory. Like Tolkien changed his mind in the Legendarium multiple times. Stuff about the first and second age, because it was done in notes and fragments, and then Christopher Tolkien was trying to match things up, and obviously, Guy Gavriel Kay had come in at a certain point to help the Silmarillion and the notes that were there. Some of that stuff is contradictory, and there has to be room and flexibility in narrative, because if all 5 of us read exactly the same book, we'll generally agree about the rough trajectory. We'll generally agree about the rough aspect of it. But when it comes to individual details, when it comes to particular themes, when it comes to certain scenes that we like or dislike, certain characters that we like or dislike, how we interpret or even visualize those characters, regardless of how they are described in the text, all those things will be individual. And we create an individual picture in our mind, an individual impression and interpretation of a narrative. And when a showrunner or a director or a writer sits down to adapt a work, They're just like the rest of us. They sit down, they read it, and they are picking up on their interpretation. They're looking at it and going, well, this is a major aspect. Now, I might read it and go, it's not really that major. It's kind of, it runs all the way through, but it's not important. That aspect that you're ignoring, that's a really major aspect. Now, which one of us is right? And so much of it is tied up in an interpretation of the text. With a lot of big fantasy series, because we can control, as fans, we can control the details. We can nail down the superficial details. That is something we can control. And if you think of how out of control the world is, and everything's spinning around and the world is ending, but this is something that we can control. And we've spent hours poring over this stuff. We have dedicated untold hours to imagining and living in this world. We are passionate about it. We love it. It fascinates us. And when we see it on screen, we want it done well. We want it done to the best ability to recreate the importance that that world has in our mind. But the practical reality is that can never actually be achieved, because what I view as important in my mind about that text is not necessarily what PL or Jolien or Steve or Dave see. Now, Olive and I obviously always agree, but Dave is always completely wrong. So if I was writing the show, it doesn't matter if I was an Oscar-winning, Pulitzer Prize-winning, Nobel laureate who had all of the author genius in the world at my fingertips. I could pen the world's greatest adaptation, and someone else watching it will go, yeah, but you didn't focus on that thing, and that was really important, and that's what I wanted. Because an adaptation can never capture that personal relationship that we have with the book in front of us, where an author and ourselves are in conversation over this text, and we're interpreting it.
I agree. I think we're willing to accept certain things from certain adaptations, whereas we wouldn't accept them from others. And I think that whole idea of canonical and what's canonical, I think that always plays into people's minds. And obviously what you believe is canonical, what you've read and because, you can pick up Lord of the Rings or Star Wars books or Star Trek books, and you could read a Star Trek book and believe this is canonical because Gene Roddenberry endorsed it or something like that, right? And whereas, another was written by, let's just say William Shatner wrote a book about this is what Captain Kirk was really like. For some people, they would consider that canonical because this is the actor, the iconic actor who played Captain Kirk, the original Captain Kirk. And so like what's canonical? I think that really factors into our minds when we think about all these interpretations. You can have a book that has an audiobook, and for you that voice actor's voice becomes the character. And if you watch the TV show made of the book and it doesn't sound like that voice actor's voice, then that's not my character. So I think a lot of it has to do with what people consider to be what's the real McCoy and what's not. So.
Yeah, and that's not to say that any adaptive choice is good. We can watch something and you can go, okay, that's a left turn at the traffic lights. Like, I don't see how that fits with the story they are telling. Because I think Jolien hit the nail on the head. When you're watching an adaptation, that is a story in and of itself. Mm-hmm. It isn't the book. It is a new thing. And if the choices within the new thing don't make sense, if they're not internally cohesive to what is going on in it, then that can be a stumbling block. Now, they could have been put in to create a contrast and juxtaposition. The modern or the new Netflix Persuasion, the new Jane Austen adaptation, deliberately picked the Regency period and the Regency costume and the English setting, and they did all of that, but they updated and modernized a lot of the dialogue to more modern English, and then had be turning to the character. It was Dakota Johnson, I think, was playing the character. She turns the camera, breaks the fourth wall with quite modern vernacular. And the thing is, Austen was doing. I don't know if you ever saw the show Gossip Girl, where it was, the gossipy look at high society. That's Jane Austen. That's Jane Austen. And Gossip Girl is modern Jane Austen. Fleabag is modern Jane Austen. That their DNA is Austenian DNA. That they are direct descendants of Jane Austen. So taking that and giving you all of the sumptuous Bridgerton and Downton Abbey visuals and going, but this is actually the modern day. So I'm going to relay it with the modern day vernacular, is an artistic choice. And it conflates the two time periods, and it brings the past into modernity, and it brings modernity into the past, and says, stop thinking about this as just the past. This is today. It's the same class war. It's the same elite snobbery going on. It's the same. These humans then are the same as humans now. And it was an attempt to try and conflate the two and be entertaining and be slightly witty and funny in a more modern way. And of course, a lot of Austen fans were very unhappy.
Yeah.
Yes, extremely.
And so that change, even though there's a rationale for it, even though you can understand it, even though it fits with what they were trying to do with that new adaptation, it didn't work. And so people are free to go, I didn't like it. But that's not the same as saying it's a bad adaptation because of that thing. You can go, that thing didn't work, but it actually, you can understand the consistency, the coherency, why it's there, the narrative reason for it being there. It fits with all of those things. And you go, that's actually quite a good thing, even if we don't like it. And it's the separation of enjoyment versus an evaluation of product, because those two things are not necessarily the same, even though we're so used to now about our consumption of narrative being the thing that we evaluate.
So is it better then? And I guess it depends on what is the thing being adapted. Do you think it's better to watch the adaptation first and then read the source material it's based on? I guess conversely, because you could literally have books written about movie. The movie came first, and then the books are written. And so, but what do you think is better? Like, what do you think? I know it's preference, but what do you prefer, and what do you think is better, to watch the movie or the TV series first, then read the books? Is one more disappointing than the other? For example, that you feel a letdown if your character isn't as dynamic in the books, or does it play a larger role in the books as they did in the movie, or do you what's better?
Well, you do is you're talking to a bunch of book readers. There's a wee bit of a bias here.
Agree, and that's why I'm asking.
All these people who go, yes, I spend all my time talking about books. Yes, but really, movies are so much better. Books are rubbish. Never read the book. But I'll give you a really fascinating example. When I was a kid, the Michael Keaton, Jack Nicholson, the Tim Burton Batman came out. And obviously, there'd been the Adam West Batman. And we've had Batman comics. And we'd had Batman cartoons. But the Tim Burton, Michael Keaton, Kim Basinger, Jack Nicholson Batman came out. And as a gift, I think it's the only film my father ever took me to. But I remember watching it in the cinema. And as a gift later on that year, I was given the novelization. And I loved the novelization. And I loved the film. And there were significant differences between the two of them. But I loved them for different things. But which one of them came first? You go, well, neither, because there was the Adam West one, and there was the TV show, and there were all of those other things, and then the comics. There is no chicken and the egg in that one. But when I encountered the Tim Burton Batman film, that narrative, I saw it as a film first, and I loved it. And then I read the book, and I loved the book. and I have rewatched the film, and I love the film. Because the two are, in my head, and whether or not I'm weird this way, but they are two distinct things.
Mhm.
They're two different ways of telling the same story. Just like I have read multiple different versions and seen multiple different versions of Little Red Riding Hood. I don't go, oh, well, that's the definitive, clearly that's the best one because it was the original. You go, I've read multiple and I like different aspects of all of them. Like we retell fairy tales all the time and we don't get hung up on which came first or it must be done this way. We like a story well told, apart from obviously in modern day adaptations of our works, in which case it doesn't matter if it's well told, it has to be exactly the same as the book.
Sure. Nick's the source one missing had a comment. I think that mentions of tie-in books warrants a discussion of the negative perceptions that they have. Many are fantastic, yet the tie-in nature of them repulses some people.
Hang on just 1 second.
Sure.
Carry on talking. I'll be back.
Okay. Maria might read that. Hi, everyone. Hoping work stays quiet enough for me to be able to listen to the chat. But I do think it's interesting because like usually I prefer to read the book first because I never really enjoy the movies or the live adaptation enough or as much. But like The Expanse, I watched the whole series and now I'm reading the books, and I think I enjoyed that because it seems there's so many characters and so much going on. So. That is a great. I've read that too when the movie came out. That's a great one, Alien 3.
But that Pat Cadigan, an amazing author, tie-in novel, tie-in novels, franchise novels. It all depends on the book. It all depends on the author, the story they're telling. If you say Forgotten Realms, who wrote the first Forgotten Realms books? Does anyone know? Chat, does anyone know who wrote the first Forgotten Realms books?
Okay,
Salvatore?
No, Douglas Niles. Salvatore wrote the most popular ones because he wrote the Icewind Dale trilogy. But Douglas Niles did the Moonshade trilogy. He was first.
Okay.
But at the time, a lot of people who were writing these were trying to write for Dragonlance because that was the hot new property. And Salvatore got in on the ground floor on Forgotten Realms, and he read Douglas Niles stuff and went, oh, as I said, it's going to be a Celtic world. And they went, oh, that's just a tiny part of it. But if you think of the number of authors who wrote amazing books set in those that entertained us, or someone who's been asked to write a film tie-in novel, and the one I talked about for Tim Burton's Batman, it had a whole sequence where Batman activates the sonar and the bats summon and swirl around him that we saw eventually in the Christopher Nolan films. But that was in the novelization for Tim Burton's Batman. They just couldn't film it. They didn't have the CGI, the practical effects to do it. So that wasn't there. But that was put into it. Alex Irvine did a brilliant Transformers script or novel. Like Alex Irvine wrote a fantastic Transformers novel that it's far better than any of those Michael Bay monstrosities. But and I know Alex actually has done a number of franchise and tie-in pieces of fiction, and he's a fantastic author, and they are absolutely a thrill to read. And tie-in fiction and franchise fiction, we don't have that pressure when we're reading to go, oh, I'm trying to figure it out. I have to see where it's going. I don't know what's going to happen next. Let me just get to the. We read it in a more relaxed fashion because it's already been spoiled. We know what's going to happen. It's been spoiled. So we are reading it, and we're actually just reading the story in front of us. We're following the story in front of us instead of trying to work to predict what's going to happen, to try and, well, is this important or that important? We don't fight the text. We don't try to command the text. We don't try to impose our will on the text. We actually just read it. And this is one of the reasons why our obsession with plot spoilers is ruining a lot of reading experiences for people because they become so obsessed with the idea that the narrative events and what happens in the narrative events are the most important thing, instead of just read what is in front of you. Let what is important come to you itself instead of I need to know now. And franchise fiction and tie-in fiction has that ability to get us to take a step back because we already know where the story's going. We already know basically what's going to happen, so we can actually just enjoy the ride. And I think it's quite a good learning experience for some readers.
But sorry, Brandon.
Oh, just really quick. I had a question for Jolien. Jolien, don't you think Koshil would be good as a TV series? I was thinking that when I was reading the first 2 books, or Bone Shard.
Yeah, Kushil definitely, but I think that it would probably be like 16 plus, something like that. But I think that a lot of people would like that one. It's great because it's one POV, it's a coming of age story, but you don't have that much internal monologue, so it's easier to film than something like Farseer, which I think would be very difficult. Even though I love The Realm of the Elderlings, I don't think that would make a good TV show. And here, Kashyyyl, even though it's very different, I think that it's similar in the way that you connect to the characters, and it would work pretty good as a TV series. Yeah.
I think talking about adapting text, I think adapting comic books must be really difficult because you have so many years and years and years of history, and you also have different authors who've taken turns. Different writers have taken turns on sometimes just a couple of issues or a couple of issues of the comics. So you have all these storylines going. So it's hard to please everyone. That must be really tough to adapt that. And that it's, even though I'm not a huge fan of the Marvel movies, I think it's great what they've done. They've done a really great job with it to please their fan base with it. So it must be tough.
He's holding back.
So you're holding back, AP. What's up?
No, because it has been pointed out to me on more than one occasion. When I'm involved in discussions like this, I don't give other people the chance to talk. And I've gone on several rants thus far. I have gone off and told people my opinion and dominated the conversation. And that is exceptionally rude. And I want to hear other people's points of view because I want to be part of the conversation, not dictating the conversation. So I apologize to everyone, and I would like to hear everyone else's point.
I'm just sitting here absorbing all this information. I'm learning a lot, so I don't mind.
Yeah, keep going.
Yeah, that's what happens when we have AP on.
But go on, PL.
No, I'm just wondering because AP's got me on this. I'm just trying to think back about if my enjoyment of my enjoyment of TV adaptations, where there's especially the TV versus book thing, if my enjoyment is spoiled knowing to a certain degree what's going to happen. I mean, obviously you don't know how much the adaptation is going to change, going to be altered from the book, but I'm just trying to think specifically of Game of Thrones versus A Song of Ice and Fire. Obviously I knew what was going to happen to Ned. I read the books. Yeah. I'm trying to recapture how I felt watching that episode, whether or not that affected my enjoyment. And I guess it's so hard to tell because I guess I would never know unless I didn't read the books first, right? So I don't believe it did. I think I still felt that sense of dread and angst and and outrage and woe is Ned. But I don't think it spoiled my enjoyment. But again, how would I know unless I had never read the books for it? Yeah. So yeah, I'd like to hear what everybody thinks.
Well, one of my favorite comic book adaptations, comic book TV shows, was Marvel's Daredevil season 1 and Jessica Jones season 1. I thought because they were both on Netflix. I think they're now being moved across to the is it Disney Plus?
Yeah.
But neither one of those was an exact adaptation either of character or of a particular storyline, but they drew elements from multiple storylines from both both Daredevil and Alias. But they were brilliantly told narratives. They were grounded in a certain aesthetic. They lent into that aesthetic, and they tried to stay true to their interpretation of the character. And that made it very, very compelling. But if someone said, well, that's not really Daredevil, you go, okay, whose run of Daredevil is the real Daredevil? Who are you picking out going, that is Daredevil? And the thing is, when we look at who's the best Bruce Wayne, because the best actor who has played Bruce Wayne is not necessarily the best actor who ever played Batman, because they are two different characters, even though they are in the physically the same person, but they're two different characters. Batman has a different personality to Bruce Wayne, and Bruce Wayne has been portrayed radically differently depending on who played them, and the time period in which that adaptation was made, and the audience with which it was being marketed to. So who's the best Batman? And frequently when we end up discussing who did the best portrayal of Batman, it's usually which Batman movie we liked the best, rather than anything to do with the analysis of which of them came across as a really good Batman. Because Christian Bale was a rubbish Bruce Wayne. Like, you saw him and he's just kind of farting around, and you're like, why does anyone believe that you're a billionaire? And you just didn't. George Clooney, on the other hand, brilliant Bruce Wayne. You could just imagine him coming in being the totally untrustworthy, smooth billionaire who just buys things and goes out on a yacht. Like, that made sense. We could believe George Clooney as Batman. Slightly less convincing than Christian Bale. Christian Bale was a lot more frightening as Batman. But which of them is the real Batman? And then when you look at, is it Batman from the Detective Comics? Is it Batman from the Justice League comics? Is it Batman for which Batman? What evolution? What version? Is there anything? Is there one aspect across all of the different portrayals of Batman that we can isolate and say that is the key aspect? And there isn't, because Batman is an amalgam of different characteristics, and each portrayal has highlighted different ones, and no pattern is the same, and no representation has always used exactly the same one. And the most recent one with Robert Pattinson, again, a very different evolution and evocation of the character, different point in his career, different attitude to what he is doing, plays it a very different way. So when we talk about adaptation and the representation of characters, and people say, oh, but they don't look right. Yeah, because Hugh Jackman really looks like Wolverine from the comics. Samuel L. Jackson didn't look like the original Nick Fury. David Hasselhoff played the first live-action version of Nick Fury because they made him look like Nick Fury. And that is a performance that everyone should go and try and find. And then go and watch Samuel L. Jackson do it and go, how can that be the same character? Fascinating. But when we have read, say, the comics, and we know what the arc of the story is. So if you've read like the Demon in the Bottle cycle for Iron Man, or you've read, say, the Frank Miller run of Daredevil, and then you see echoes of that in whatever adaptation, you know what a lot of the major story beats are going to be, but you don't know how they're going to tell them. And this is what I sometimes try to get across. It is in the telling of a good story a lot of the time that we get the enjoyment. Columbo, the TV show, proved you could know who did the murder at the start, because the joy and the compulsion in watching that was watching Columbo figure it out. It is the antithesis to what people thought a murder mystery had to be, where you had to give clues to the viewer or the reader so that they could try and work it out faster than the detective. Columbo went, no, we're going to show the viewer, and then they're going to know more than Columbo. And the viewer is sitting there going, oh, he's figured that bit out. He's figured that bit out. And you were on the edge of your seat wanting Peter Falk to go, just one more question. And yes, he's nailed him. There was an excitement in that. And these are all different ways of approaching what Wolfgang Iser, one of my commenters corrected me. I've been calling him Wolfgang Iser. I've been mispronouncing it. Wolfgang Iser talked about the knowledge gap. Readers and viewers often know far more than a character. And because of that, if whoever has crafted the narrative is aware of that gap, they can play with it. They can make a reader feel smarter because the characters are behind the knowledge arc of the reader. Or they can make characters appear smarter because they're ahead of the knowledge arc of the reader. And you can play with that. And it all has to do with what style of narrative the author or the writer is trying to create and what effect they're trying to create in a viewer. So pre-knowledge of what is going to happen means that you aren't relying on twists. What you're relying on is a different aspect of how are the characters going to work it out. There's an emphasis more on that aspect. Not knowing the ending, then maybe you want to focus more on that aspect of I need to drip feed and put little breadcrumbs down so the reader can figure it out. Do I want the reader to figure it out before the characters or after the characters? And it all depends on the style of narrative.
You know what? As you were talking, you know what a show that brought to my mind was Lost. Because that was a show. I might make some people angry when I say this, but that is today still one of my the shows that I enjoyed watching the most. I thought it was phenomenal storytelling, but that is the quintessential example of like there really was no ending. That was a show that kind of showed you it didn't matter what the ending was, because there really wasn't one. But it was still great storytelling, I thought. And I enjoyed that 6 years watching it. And I'm glad I did because I had a great time at it.
I love Lost too. There was a season there that was a little drug on a little bit too much. You could I love the series as a whole, but there was a season or there's some episodes that were just total fluff, just need to be there. But I think that was the network wanting to stretch it out and get more eyeballs on the channel because it was so popular. But I think it could have been if it was a season shorter, I think, with the same story, I think people would have a different opinion. I love the series, but I think overall people would have a different opinion on it if it was like, a season shorter, just because there was so much on there that didn't need to be there and that watered it down a little bit.
Yeah.
It's so funny, and I certainly don't pretend to speak on behalf of all writers, but I think if you did a poll, the vast preponderance of writers would give their left arm to have their books adapted to, TV, film, etc., right? But then when you really think about it, at the same time, most writers would be completely outraged and devastated if the adaptation of their work became something that they did not believe was an accurate or authentic adaptation of their work. But the whole point, as we've been talking about adaptation, it's not supposed to necessarily be directly representative of the work. So, I mean, that's that catch-22, I guess, of, and I said, I mentioned earlier about the length of time it typically takes for adaptations to come out, because of all kinds of things, contractual things, especially that, and I think it was Nathaniel that had mentioned that, those adapting don't want to be beholden to authors in terms of the supposed authenticity of their adaptations, and a lot of these adaptations are done after the author's dead, and it's the estate that's providing the rights. Like, I know for me, if someone said to me, and I think Steve and I talked about this with Zamil Akhtar, the author of Gunmetal Gods and Maybe Between the Pages, and Laura Leonard from Laura Lullabies on one of our podcasts, that because we're specifically referencing JRM and like wondering how he feels about the whole thing, like, and that got me thinking, how would I feel if someone decided to back up a truckload of money to my door and said, hey, we want to make an adaptation of your books, and they were completely different from what I had in my mind I had envisioned them to be. But let's just say they're wildly successful, made a whole bunch of money, made me a whole bunch of money, and gave me, worldwide fame and popularity. Would I trade that for the fact that I don't like them? Because
I would recommend to you that what you do is you cry yourself to sleep on those silk sheets on the giant yacht that you bought with all that TV adaptation money. You just cry yourself to sleep and go, no one will really appreciate my story. Beautiful silk pillow as I'm on holiday in the Mediterranean on my 200-foot yacht. And you channel that pain into your next book. That's the only way forward I can see for you. But Bill, let me ask you a question. So obviously you have written a story. You've worked with an editor. At some point you have worked with an editor has come back to you and said, right, you might need to move this thing around.
Yeah, a lot.
I wasn't making any assumptions, but an editor said you possibly need to change this thing. There's an issue with this. Could you possibly shift that around, move that earlier, change this thing, maybe gender swap that character? There may be suggestions. I have no idea, but there will have been suggestions about changes to your work. Now, let's say you get a deal and they're going to make it into a TV show, and they come up and they go, right, we have 10 episodes. Where are you going to put the 10 divisions in your book? Because you don't have 10 neatly even chapters. So where are you putting the 10 divisions? And you go, oh, right. Well, maybe if we move that, next thing you know, you're going, right, chuck that line out, get rid of that character. See, those two characters, squish them together. They can be the same person. You only need to hire one actor. Let's not waste money on that. I want more of the cut. And, kick them out. We don't want them. Don't spend any money on CGI. They can use cardboard swords. It'll be fine. You'll be in there. You'll be changing things, because as long as they get what you think of as the heart of the story right, a lot of the things, even the things that you're proudest of, even the details that you think are brilliant and intricate and work really well within your writing, when it comes down to it, you're putting it in a new form. And there are certain things that you go, this is the heart of my story. So I know I have a scene here where these two people argue. That doesn't fit anymore. That's going on the cutting room floor. How can I fit the essence of that scene somewhere else? Oh, we can put it here, and I can do it here, because the essence of it, the heart of it, the power of it is not necessarily in that individual scene. It's in the communication of what you feel you're trying to get to your viewer or your reader. And you can do that in completely different ways. And so you would hope that in an adaptation, that authentic experience of your story would be communicated. That's what you'd be aiming for. But if they offered you a boatload of cash and said, we want to turn it into a comedy, we think it'll be a laugh riot, but we're going to change these things, you might go, yeah, but that boat in the Mediterranean is really nice. Okay, I don't know that this adaptation exists. If anyone asks, I'll just say, I'm hired as an executive producer and they're giving me a cut of the profits. Everyone go see it. I'm sure it's great.
PL, is it? Isn't it A Drowned Kingdom in audio as well?
Yes, it is. The first book is in audio.
So you didn't read the audio? Did you read the audio?
No, I would never dare. I learned my lesson the hard way. I did. It was for Quarencom. It was Virginia Livingston and it was P.S. Livingston and Virginia McLean. They're running Quarencom. Fantastic authors themselves, and they asked me to do a reading from my second book. I took maybe 3 hours to, properly read, what should have been a 5-minute in terms of the editing. Oh, thank you, Steve. In terms of me constantly fumbling my words and going back and I leave that to the experts. I could not do my own audiobook. My hats off to people that do. I had two fantastic voice actors, Adam Curtin and Sean Polite. One, Adam Curtin voiced the main character's voice and some of the auxiliary characters that were from the same place. And then Sean Polite did the rest of the characters from the continent that the other characters go to. So, and believe me, they were phenomenal, but I could not for the life of me do that. That's far above my skill set. I think I'll just stick to, not saying I'm the best writer, but I think I'll stick to writing rather than narration.
Because that too, right, is an adaptation of a. So it depends what your definition of an adaptation is, but
unless it's unabridged, right? If and that's.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. No.
No, and that's
no.
that's even a further example of where it's abridged. But even if it's unabridged, right? I mean, in that situation, you have not a single word of text being changed, right? All that every single word of text is still there, but it's now in a different medium, and those words are being performed in a certain manner, and that the way those people are perform. The way those people are doing those performances are not necessarily how they could be presenting those characters in a way that is not how you envisioned them when you wrote them, or the way Steve envisioned them when he read them. And so it just seems like just the very act of, I think this is what AP was saying a little more eloquently, but just the very act of switching mediums in any way is automatically going to necessitate some kind of changes that is not going to be, those changes are going to be different for different people.
And I want to give AP his point as well. For me, after listening to my audiobook, the voice actor Adam Curtin, that voices Othrin, my main character, because he captures the essence of the snarky, privileged, bigoted, completely disdainful, he, in my mind,
there's no need to slag me off like that. I'm still here.
Yeah, so because he totally encapsulates what that character's about. In my head, when I write future installments, in my head, Adam Curtin's voice is Othrin, right? And I can't get that in my head. Now, maybe down the road, if, for example, I do an audiobook for the second or third book, and for some reason we have to change voice actors because Adam Curtin's available, or because we elect that because the character ages through, the various installments, that we choose an actor with an older voice. But for me right now, that's him. I feel like it would take a lot for me to not visualize that voice, at least, and attach it to, now my imagination of what Othrin looks like, to create the character, right? So, because that's there's only 2 books out, so that's for me, and the only one's an audiobook. So for me, that's how I'm experiencing. But for everyone else, it's going to be totally different. Sorry, I want to let AP get his.
No, I wanted to pick up on Dave's point, because I think this is it's a fairly important point, and I think on the online discourse about the difference between reading a text and listening to an audiobook. And before I launch into any discussion of this, I want to make it very clear from the outset: physically reading a text, be it with your eyes or with Braille, or listening to an audiobook, I regard them as different, but that does not mean that I am saying that reading is better than listening. That acknowledging that they are slightly different things. They are slightly different ways to consume the narrative. And for me, there's a very important difference. And when you read a text, it is the text and the consumer of the text. So you're either doing it through your eyes or through your fingers with Braille, but there is no intermediary. There is no narrator interpreting the text for you. It's all you and the text. So it's the author through the text to you. With an audiobook, there is a performance. And as soon as you add a performance, that shapes and changes aspects of the text. That does not mean in any way that listening to an audiobook is not as worthwhile or not as good as reading a book. But as soon as you listen to a performance, it is changing what the text is. And if you read a play and then watch the performance of a play, even if it's you read a monologue and then you watch the performance of the monologue. So if you read Hamlet's To Be or Not to Be, and then you watch Laurence Olivier do it, and then you watch Kenneth Branagh do it, or Ralph Fiennes do it, or Sir Ian McKellen do it, or they will all have their own way of doing it. They will put pauses in different places. They will put emphasis in different places. And the thing is, audiobooks, we live in an age where we have amazing performers of audiobooks. They bring so much life to characters. They choose accents for characters. In the olden days, an audiobook was basically text to speech. It was a monotone where they just delivered everything. But now we have these actors, these performers, and they take a character and they assign an accent and a voice and a timbre and a tone to that character. Now, if, for instance, someone was doing the Wheel of Time books and the Sonnet gave them all Texan accents because Robert Jordan had said in a letter that that's how he imagined their accent, a drawl like a Texan. Now, can you imagine reading The Wheel of Time and suddenly this Texas drawl comes out when before you've been assuming, oh, well, they're kind of English sounding and they're kind of that sounding and they're upper class. And then these people are from Texas? What? That could be very jarring. And suddenly, because of how you in the real world interpret or think about a Texas accent, that's going to change how you think about those characters within the text. But if you're just reading the text, you go, oh, it's a foreign accent, and you just imagine it. You might assign a Texas accent, but you might assign something else that you imprint on it. And that's one of the things that makes reading so individual. So when someone reads to us, it is a performance. And that performance can shape our understanding and interpretation of a text. And that's why I say the two are different. I have enjoyed and loved listening to audiobooks. I enjoy and love reading books. I view the two things as different because to me, they are actually quite different. They are two different ways of consuming a narrative. But there are strengths and weaknesses to both. And I think the online discourse about this gets so het up in, oh, audiobooks, people who say audiobooks aren't reading are just being ableist. And you go, well, why are you ascribing so much importance to the word read? Do you think that listening is not as good? Why are you agreeing with the premise of this ridiculous argument? We're all consuming narrative, but there are strengths and weaknesses. There are differences to both. And recognizing that they are different is not the same as saying this one is better than that one. Depending on circumstance, depending on what you're doing, depending on what you're using it for, depending on the type of narrative, audiobook could be far better than physical book, or vice versa. But I think they are different. And when people do reviews, when people talk about the books that they have read, I actually think it's important to say, well, I listened to this one as an audiobook, because I think at the very least, they should be crediting the performance of the audiobook narrator. I listened to The Expeditionary Force by Craig Allinson, and R.C. Bray is the audiobook narrator. And R.C. Bray does an amazing job with it. And if I reviewed that series and I didn't mention the audiobook version and the audiobook narrator, I just went, oh, I just read these books. That's a disservice to the person who gave the performance that I love so much. So you credit the author, you credit the artist, and the person who did the audiobook narration is an artist, just like any other actor.
Jolene, how do you? I'm curious. Do you prefer audiobooks or physical books? Do you have a preference? I know that I've had some readers that have loved either one of my books, didn't prefer the other. For example, started the audiobook, didn't like it, read the physical book, enjoyed it. Read the physical book, didn't like it, but listened to the audiobook and loved it. Have you had that experience, and do you have a preference for?
Well, for me, it definitely depends on the narrator. Sometimes I just really love how the story is being told, and then I do prefer the audiobook. And sometimes I just know that the voice isn't what I like. I especially don't like if there are strong accents, and maybe that is because English is not my native language. So if there is a strong accent, it gets me out of the story. I need to think too much what they are actually saying. And then I always try the physical book, just to see if it's the narrator or if it's really the story that I don't like. Um, an interesting example maybe is Malazan. I started reading it as a physical book, and I read it as very grim, very bleak. And then I switched to the audiobook for a while, and people were making jokes. I never read all of those lines as jokes. I always read them like extremely serious. So I actually switched back to the physical book, but now I am reading it. Maybe light is not the correct word, but I can at least recognize when it's not as serious as I would have initially thought it was. So sometimes it can also help, I think, because I would suspect that at least the author and the narrator have some sort of understanding of how it should be interpreted. So I do think that those should be jokes. So it did help me get through Malazan, but I still prefer it as a physical book, and that's probably because of how complex it is. And for my audiobooks, I prefer to be a little bit more simple, I suppose, because then I can follow more easily.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I had said I went through those first two Malazan books, and I actually bought the audiobook versions already, because I figured when I went back to it, I would just listen to them in the car. I would do it on audio. I'm going to have to restart over again. I figured I would do it by audio in the car. But I wasn't sure I was going to do it that way. I bought them because they were on sale, but now I'll definitely do it that way. Now that I know that. Have you, AP, have you listened to the audios?
Well, that's not strictly true. I have started listening to the audio book of a couple of them, but my major preference is to read a physical text. I prefer reading a physical text over even reading on a laptop screen or on an e-reader. I prefer and enjoy more holding a book and reading a book. It adds to my immersion. When I'm working, I have a tendency to slip into work mode if I am looking at it on a computer screen, because that's how I edit. I'm sitting looking at a manuscript and marking it up as I am. So when I read on a computer screen, I almost switch reading mode and go from pleasure reading to work reading, which engages more of the editor brain and you need to fix this. I don't do that as much when I'm reading for pleasure. But with audiobooks, it depends very much on the type of audiobook, whether I can listen to it. And I tried listening to the Malazan books, and I couldn't do it because that's not my experience of it. It's not my understanding of it. And the pronunciation of various names, the accents that were given to people, I just went, nope. That is not how I imagine the world. I am going to get annoyed every time he pronounces the name that. No, I'm done. And I turned it off. But I was listening to Emma Gregory's The God Is Not Willing reading, the latest Malazan book. And Emma Gregory was doing, I was going, yeah, I could listen to this one. I'm really enjoying this. For some reason, that didn't set off the same things. Whereas the earlier Malazan books, I couldn't listen to on audio at all. Very, very bizarre. But do you want me to give you a story about me being incredibly dumb and an author doing a reading performance that completely changed my mind about a book? I was at a small convention in Belfast, TitanCon, and Joe Abercrombie happened to be there. And I like the First Law books. But I had just read The Heroes, and it was the book that he was going to places and he was doing readings from. And I just read The Heroes, and I wasn't as huge a fan of The Heroes. And the reason being, I thought it was lacking in humor. Whereas The First Law, there was a wryness and a comedic undertone to so much of it. There was a cynical laughter permeating it. And I really loved that in The First Law. And when I read The Heroes, I went, this officer that had come up he was very pompous and he was arrogant, and it was driving me insane. And I was like, I loathe this character. This is not enjoyable to read. And it ruined a lot of my enjoyment of the book. So anyway, we were at this thing, and Joe Abercrombie gets up to do a reading. And he reads a section that has that character in it. And suddenly, as he is performing it, I went, I am an idiot. We're meant to be making fun of the pompous, arrogant officer. We're not meant to be reading him as straight and so, oh, you idiot, AP. How can you have misread that? And I went back and I reread the book with this in my mind and went, there's a lot more humor here than I realized. Yeah, I'm an idiot. And that's something that a performance can really get across. And it was something I had missed in the reading. And, you know, I have tiny partial defense because there's a whole cultural reason why I read it that way. But it's no excuse. I did misread it. And the author had to step in and metaphorically go, it's meant to be funny. And it was as soon as I heard it, he did half of one line of dialogue and I went, I'm an idiot. And that's the power of performance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, First Law is one of those series where I really like the audiobooks. And I think that for most people, it would probably increase their enjoyment.
I love First Law. I love I never read their audiobooks. I love the physical books. And Abercrombie, his character work is just spectacular. And that's my jam. Fair warning. So for Jolien and especially AP, you know, Steve's read the book. And if Dave Revenge is there, you're going to get the first person perspective, a very pompous, arrogant, irritating, you know, person in my book. So fair warning, you know, if that makes you stop, then Steve's read the book. And I think that even comes out more in the audiobook. But again, I do believe it's funny if he would say that. I think that the humor, the underlying humor of the character and his nasty wit comes out more in the audiobook. You know, you'll find he'll say these lines, you'd be like, oh my God, how could you say that? But you end up chuckling because of the way he says it and what he says. I don't know if Steve found that with the audiobook, but so fair warning.
But we even say this, like when I was at school and we had to study Shakespeare, and one of the early lessons that my English teacher taught us was if you're struggling with the lines in Shakespeare, the dialogue in Shakespeare, read it aloud. Hear what it sounds like aloud. Because some writing, not all, but some writing is written to be heard, is written to be spoken. And when writing is in that style, when it is to be oral, when it is to be transmitted that way, and we use different rhetorical techniques when we're telling a story to someone than maybe when we are writing, because it depends on the register, the type of narrative. But reading something aloud sometimes can completely change our understanding because we put inflection in different places. We pause in different places. We start to run out of breath and go, oh, there must be a pause somewhere. Oh, it's there. I missed that. And little things like that. And suddenly when you realize where the stress falls in a sentence, that can change the meaning of a sentence. And because if you think of like when someone's being sarcastic, stress is change in sarcasm. Or when someone is being insincere, it's not you, it's me. No one who has ever had someone say that to them is going, you know what, they are right, it is them and not me. We all sit there go, it's very nice of you to say that, but I know you're blaming me. But sometimes when we read, we forget that characters lie, or that characters are not always just telling us the actual literal truth. And so, but that character said this thing happened, and you go, like, engage your brain. The characters walk into a bar and say, we need to find this thing. And the guy goes, oh yeah, it's over there. Why is that guy going to help them? He's good. So they walk out and they immediately get captured by the guards. How did that happen? The barman told us, oh, hang on, the barman's loyal to the crown. And we came in asking, how can we kill the king? Kind of walked into that trap. But if you're reading it aloud and you play through these things as if they are characters, suddenly you start thinking of them as characters and not just lines on a page. And part of that, it all depends on the type of way that you approach narrative. But performance forces us to create personality for characters when they are performed, because we try to embody them and make them distinct. And as soon as we do that, we differentiate characters a lot more. When we differentiate characters, then that changes how we're reading them.
Spectre had a comment. As a longtime Conan fan, none of the film adaptations had anything to do with the books. They were good enough for me to get into reading the books and comics. That's all I can hope for these days.
The second Schwarzenegger Conan was based on one of the Conan stories, and the modern one, was it with who played Conan in the more modern one?
Aquaman.
Well, Jason Momoa was in
Momoa.
the most recent one.
And elements of that were from one of the stories. But of course, my favorite bit was always when Schwarzenegger walks past the camel and punches the camel in the head, which definitely wasn't in the books. But do you know what's really weird about, because we were talking earlier on about the idea of the original and the film and the adaptation and all this sort of stuff. Do you remember they tried to make a John Carter of Mars film? And it felt very derivative, and it felt like we'd seen everything before and there was nothing really new to it. And you go, but John Carter of Mars, is a very old text. It has influenced so much, including Star Wars and including all of these other films and things that we've seen. So when the text finally got adapted, we went to it, this thing that had shaped the minds of a generation of science fiction and fantasy writers. Because it had shaped those minds and we'd read the things that they wrote, we saw this thing and went, well, that's a bit generic. That's a bit bland, because it typified the genre. And it's so bizarre, because when you go back to reading that text, that because of the style of writing in that text, because it is a much older text, it seems much more distinct than the film, which was very, very modern in its style and how it was communicated. And it was a really interesting sort of clash of those different elements.
I wonder if all the, to Spectre's comment previously, I wonder if the live adaptations, if the success of them leads people to read. Is that something that helps the book sales at all? Is that something that just, do people watch and say, I want to read the book now, or do they just say, that was great, on to the next thing? That, there's so many options now on streaming services, and or will they take the time away to read the book instead of watching the next recommended series on Netflix?
Every study has shown that even with a bad adaptation, book sales go up for at least 6 months. With a really successful adaptation, book sales spike and carry on going up for more than 6 months. But film and television adaptations lead to spikes in book sales. Even for bad adaptations or critically panned adaptations, there is an increase in book sales for at least 6 months.
Okay, authors, so go out there and try and desperately badger movie and TV executives to constantly pitch your books to try and get an adaptation, I guess, is the message. So,
but that's the big thing about adaptation. Adaptation for film and TV, they are for a general audience. They're not just for the established fans of whatever the book is, because that is very rarely an audience of sufficient size to commercially support the adaptation. So you need to broaden the audience. You need a more general audience. And, we read, well, first of all, reading is a niche hobby now. It's not as big as it once was. In my day, when the world was still in sepia, reading was all we did. And we also wanted to play with a stick. But reading is a bit of a niche hobby. And then within reading, we read a niche genre, fantasy. And within fantasy, we might be reading a niche subgenre, like epic fantasy or military fantasy or adventure fantasy. Like smaller and smaller boxes. And even the biggest and most well-known fantasy series, bar one or two exceptions, very rarely has a fandom of a size large enough to support a big commercial adaptation. So, by necessity, because we live in a capitalist system, they have to try to craft the narrative that will be more accessible to people who do not generally consume the niche of the niche of the niche. So there is a flattening of it. And one of the things that we've always seen in the past, and we've actually been quite happy about, is when filmmakers or TV producers have made something and they throw in an Easter egg, they throw in something just for the book fans. And you go, it was always so nice when you were watching something and you caught it and went, I know what that is. And the person sitting next to you who hasn't read the book is like, what are you talking about? You're like, I know something you don't know. I know something you don't know. I read the book and you haven't. But that was the relationship that we had, that we all understood the adaptation was for a general audience and that the people making it would try to ensure that aspects, like book fans, we know this isn't exactly what you wanted, but we're going to put these things in because we acknowledge you. We are fans of the material as well. That's why we took the job to adapt it. But that was the relationship. And I think that has changed quite a lot, that dynamic, that now we have an expectation that they are going to make it just for us.
Yeah, that's true. Hannah Blackwell had a question. What do you all think about shows that got turned into books or graphic novels, like the reverse of what we usually see?
So Buffy, Angel, Firefly. Trying to think, who else got the later seasons turned into graphic novel series? Those are the three off the top of my head.
Yeah. I couldn't bring myself to read the Firefly books. It just didn't feel right. I don't know.
It was a lovely little miniseries. And I'm happy that I got that. Would it have been nice to get a second season? Yeah. Do I need to have had a second season? No. Yeah. We just don't talk about the film.
Any other Firefly fans here? Dave, Yulene, or PL?
No, not a fan. Heard of it, but not a huge fan. Not a huge fan.
What about
Yulene?
Buffy?
Buffy, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Buffy, yes.
Yeah.
The film or the TV show?
The TV show. The
TV
TV show.
Because obviously the film came first, and then the TV show adapted the film and changed the tone and the genre. Changed a whole load of the lore.
So,
Like,
some of
that's
us,
a terrible adaptation.
some of us are old enough to have watched Buffy, on live on TV as teenagers.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Spectre mentions the X-Files was a good TV to book series.
Yeah.
Huh.
I don't know. I just think that, like, AP was mentioning Batman earlier. Like, I still have, as a kid, and in my head, regardless of how many iterations of Batman I see, the campy, crazy Adam West version of Batman is always going to be near and dear to my heart, because from the captions, Pam, wow, when someone gets punched and the punch is totally missing, but the actor, like, I love that stuff, man. It was just amazing. But in that, there are also some real nuggets, amazing performances hidden in that totally slapstickish, Cesar Romero. Like, there's some really actually great acting buried. Like, you can see the nuggets right in there. And I always when I think of Batman, I still think of that Batman. Although I've watched almost every iteration of Batman there is, from DC to, like, you name it, I've seen them all. But for some reason, that's Batman for me, right? So,
And I didn't see the Adam West Batman when it first aired. I am not that old. However, I did see reruns. People were
so did I. It's reruns. I didn't see the first one.
But people have said, "Oh, I'm not that old." You're like, reruns exist, and then streaming services happened, and we had video on demand. Like, it is possible to watch shows that happened before you were born. I wasn't around for MASH, but I still have seen MASH. This reminds me of when I was teaching, and we were talking about perception of reality and how language can shape reality and how signs and signifiers work, and depending on what a whole Don't. That's a whole thing we don't need to talk about. But I had asked them, have you seen The Matrix? And my students looked at me with a completely straight face and went, no, I don't watch old movies.
Wow.
And a little bit of my soul just shriveled up and died. Someone called The Matrix an old movie. I just went, oh, God, it got me right in the soul. Oh.
Yeah.
That's when I realized I was old.
My kids say that classical fantasy to them is anything that was written prior to 2010. That's classical fantasy.
God.
So I mean, my oldest is my oldest is 33 and my youngest is 18. So I had the same reaction. I had to
Where do they live? Where do they live? I will hunt them down.
But I mean, I had to accept that in their mind, you know, Jenny Wirt's books, George R. R. Martin's books, Stephen Donaldson's books, Erickson's books, they see them as like me, these people that are over 50 and they wrote these books decades ago and they have this body of work that's so to them that's, you know, and they don't even connect Tolkien. Tolkien's kind of like he's kind of like an island for them, right? You know what I mean? Like he's on an island for them. Like he's just the guy that
always existed. Fantasy always existed, but sure, it's always been this way. And you go, no, what's wrong? But this is the same when we were younger. When we were reading stuff and someone said, "Oh, that's from the 1960s," and you go, "Oh, well, that's old," and they go, "Oh God, yeah, God, 1960s! Oh, how dare you!" And then when they were talking to people who were the generation before them, "Well, that's from the 40s. That's old." Oh God, right in the. And that's as we get older, we suddenly realize like how dumb we were to the people who were older than us who were trying to explain about traditions and histories and the evolutions of things. And it wasn't always this way. And they weren't going, "Get off my lawn, you crazy kids." They were trying to explain that quite often we had such a limited view because we were starting on a journey. And we were starting from a position where we thought, this is the norm. This has always been this way. And they went, it hasn't. It's only just become that. And the journey you're on is starting hundreds of miles down the road from where lots of other people started. And that applies not only to the perception of genre, but you know, when we think about different aspects of our lives in the real world, that things that we take for granted today, 20 years ago, we mightn't have been able to take those things for granted. And 20 years before that, it might have been a radically different situation as well. And we forget change happens. And as soon as it happens and we get acclimated to it, we forget what it was like before the change happened. And the people who have grown up with that, well, they don't even know what it was like before. Sure, you're just exaggerating. And it's a bizarre generational thing. And it took me getting older, not necessarily growing up. I have clearly never grown up, but getting older to gain that perspective and realize what an idiot I've been the vast majority of my life.
But things move farther and farther into the past, right? You know, T.H. White, you know, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, you know, they're moving farther and farther into the past. It might as well be Homer or Milton or Sir Thomas Malory for some people. That's how far in the past it is for some people. It doesn't, you know, it's irrelevant as to which century or because if you were born in, you know, 1989, 1992, you know, for you, what's the difference? It's a bunch of old dead people that wrote this, right? You know, that's how I've heard, you know, people my kids' age describe it. It's a bunch of old.
Fair, they were alive when they wrote it. They didn't write it when they did it. Because if they did, that is damn fine work. Those corpse hands coming up and describing how very H.P. Lovecraft of them. The author is dead. Yes, we know. He keeps coming up out of the ground, typing on the typewriter, and then going back down again.
Oh, typewriter. See, you're dating yourself. You said typewriter. You're dating yourself. I showed my.
This is after a full stop. That hill I will die on.
My first university paper was written on a typewriter, and there's a picture, and I showed my youngest daughter who's 18, and a while ago I showed this to her, and she's like, "Daddy, what is that? That's the weirdest looking computer I've ever seen." And it's again, it's perspective, right? So,
I have literally seen young children who have picked up a book. And they've been trying to swipe to get the page that's not how you turn a page, but they've been swiping because they've gotten so used to using an iPad and the thing on an iPad or whatever device, but they got used to swiping as the way to do it because that's what you do. And then when they pick up a different form of technology that is a little bit older, it doesn't work that way. But it's not because that's, I think, something we forget. Life changes so rapidly in some ways and becomes the new norm.
Nathaniel Robinson had a comment. In another stream, AP said that there was a tendency for writers, perhaps due to the market pressures, to use a cinematic style. Why is that not actually leading to adaptations?
Because there are thousands of writers and there's only hundreds of production companies. And thousands of writers produce thousands and thousands of works, and TV production companies are producing only one thing or a couple of things at a time. So there are way more works to be adapted. Plus, that's being produced today. And then you think last year and the year before and the 80 years before that, where we have all of these amazing works. There's a massive backlog of works that can be adapted. And more are being produced every single day. There aren't enough TV production and film production companies, and there aren't enough hours in the day and streaming services and money in the world for us to sit and watch everything that they produce. So,
and Andrew dropped by to say congratulations on your new grandchild, PL.
So much, Andrew. Wonderful guy. Fantastic YouTuber. Check out Andrew's stuff. He's great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He's great.
Jonathan had a question. PL drinking that Henny?
No, this is actually Mount Gay Rum, one of the oldest rums in the world, if not the oldest, from Barbados. I believe it's the 18th century, late 17th. I'm not sure, but this is Barbados's national drink. Might as well be considered a national drink, other than Banks beer. So it's cheers to you, Jonathan. It's not Henny, it is Mount Gay Rum.
So I'm just going through talking amongst yourselves. I'm just going through the trying to commentary I fell behind.
And there's a lot.
Yeah. Sorry, everybody. I'm trying to keep up with the comments. It's going to get tough. I appreciate all of you coming by. It's just sometimes it's tough to get everybody's questions.
You folks draw a crowd on Fridays, man. Fridays are pretty hyped. You guys draw a crowd. Glad to sneak in there. I'm sorry. I'm the B team. I'm only here because the fantastic Maid Between the Pages was ill, unfortunately. Hope you're feeling better. Taylor, if you're watching.
Hang on a sec. Taylor said she was ill. We just know she's playing hooky. We know she had something better to do with her time, because she swaned into the comments there going, oh guys, yeah, hi. We all know she's out having a whale of a time. Some celebrity do. She's hanging out with A-list stars.
Yeah.
And hang on, I'll just let me pretend I'm at home. I'm curled up in bed. Oh, I'm so sick. Yes, I'll have that.
Yeah, Taylor does like to roll with the rich and famous. So I'm sorry you got a less intelligent and much less better looking guest as a replacement, but that's what you're stuck with today. So
And, Dave,
Thanks, Randy.
Yeah, an hour and a half. I just realized what your shirt says. Yeah.
Same.
The only shirts I have now are dog shirts and book shirts. That's like my entire closet.
Okay, Taylor's just said that she is actually very sick, and now I feel terrible for saying all of that. I'm very sorry. I hope you feel better soon. If you are actually sick, if you are, I hope you get better soon. If
Please get better soon, Taylor.
Yeah.
Please get better soon.
Hi,
Typewriter, Laura. Hey, Lana. Yes. What is this thing you speak of? This alien gadget.
Yeah, making a mistake on a
8:55 a.m.
typewriter is a
That's
big
the
difference.
after party time, isn't it? That's why you have time to chat to us.
I remember getting the I must have been around 18 or something, getting an electronic typewriter, and that was like such a fancy, newfangled device, that I had. I felt so cool having this electronic thing, because you could actually type like one line, in advance, and you could actually correct your mistakes for one line's worth.
Yeah, making a mistake on a typewriter was a big ordeal, so you have to be really careful. Now it's you make a mistake and you backspace and it's over. But
Or things that we take for granted, cutting and pasting.
Yeah.
Why is it called cutting and pasting? Because you used to actually have to cut out a bit of paper and then paste it on top of a different bit of paper. That's why it's called that. And that's why the symbol for it are the scissors. And you go like, the save symbol. Trying to explain a floppy disk to someone who wasn't around when floppy disks existed. Why does the save button look like that? How did you get that real life sculpture of a save button? That's a floppy disk.
I'm just glad that liquid paper has not been totally rendered redundant yet, because I love liquid paper. I love liquid paper. I'm sorry.
There are groups you can go to that'll get you off that. I mean, that's terrible idea.
Not sniffing at AP.
I'm sorry, PL. I'm joking.
I went to college. That's what I went to college with, was a word processor. Most people didn't have personal computers when I went.
Word processors. Wow. I'm feeling very old. I'm feeling old, very old right now.
Well, we are very old, PL. I hate to tell you.
You're right. I mean, I have a grandchild. Yeah.
But it beats the alternative.
Yes. Something I always say. It definitely beats. Being above ground is definitely much more enjoyable.
As I had to point out in another stream, when Alexander the Great was my age, he'd been dead for over 10 years. Yeah. So I like to think that I'm doing something right.
Yeah, the increased life expectancy is a nice little, nice little benefit of modern life that I like to enjoy.
Sometimes my students will ask me if I can give them some liquid paper and just look at them like, you expect me to buy you liquid paper to use?
Well, now you have the rollers. It comes in the nice little. You don't have to dab and worry about how meticulous you are with the,
Because the rollers were non-toxic and you couldn't be abused in like whatever substance abuse way. The Tipex, and then the thing to dissolve Tipex, you actually had to have two different.
Yeah, two different.
It was complicated.
Yeah, it was.
Just write in pencil, and then you can use an eraser. Which I had to translate into American there, because of course over here we would have called it a rubber, but then people would be going, "Why are you using a rubber in class?" Always be aware of the context of the situation.
Well, I had a work dinner meeting with somebody once that, and he was Chinese, and a lot of the Chinese people that I work with, they'll pick American names because it's hard for us to say their Chinese names, which is very considerate. And he had picked Johnson, and so we were just having a good time at dinner one night, and I guess accidentally broke the news to him about what his another meaning for his name in America. He was a little bit shocked.
Just ruined his day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it could be a point of pride, right? You never know.
So, Jolien, how is your reading slump going? Are you out of your reading slump? I know you had a period there.
It's still there. Yeah, I've not been reading for a couple of days now, and when I read, it's like half an hour, and I get out of the zone. I think I always think that when I'm taking a break from work that I'm going to read more, but I'm actually reading less because I'm out of my normal schedule. So I just get lazy and not really do a lot. But I have one more week left, and then I have to go back to work. So normally, then it picks up again.
Yeah, those reading slumps are really, really tough. What I did is I forced myself by doing themed months. So I elected, I'm going to read, you know, dark fantasy in February. I'm going to read, comedy in March. I'm going to read, so that structure really helped me because that's how I am. And I don't know, I also picked up some books I might have not otherwise have read. So that was one technique I used to kind of bust the slump, is to, force some real definitive structure into my reading. And then I was like, okay, you know what? And also taking breaks. I know Steve is big on that. Like, sometimes you're reading, for example, a string of, grimdark stuff is like, ooh, you know what? I need a break and you need a palate cleanser. And I just did that recently. I got into some more fantasy romance. It was fantastic. And then now I'm back into winding my way back into the dark stuff and, preparing for, some darker fare. And it's worked well. So, but whatever you can do to bust the slump, I guess, is, everybody's different.
Yeah.
So.
I think that for me, it's actually the other way around because I've had TBRs for so long that it's like I have to read this because this is on my list. And sometimes I'm just not feeling it, but it's on the TBR. So it's partially just a mind game that I need to get over because I think lately a couple of weeks ago I picked up a different book that somebody asked me to buddy read like right on the spot. Picked it up, it was completely different from what I'm reading right now, and I loved it. And I read it in a couple of days. And then I went back to like the dense fantasy, and it seems like my mind just can't handle it right now. So maybe I just need to let go of the TBR for a while.
It's a mood read.
Whatever works. I know for me, we're back to Malazan again. I'm sorry, guys. It's going to be a quick one. Malazan helped me read The Darkness That Comes Before, which Steve and Zara from some books of Zara, a few people had been hyping up, and I was really intrigued. Malazan specifically, that book helped prepare me for, and I didn't find The Darkness That Comes Before as complex. And it's not about the complexity. I'm just saying that, like Mazda is obviously a tough read. I'm going to be having people like AP help me figure it out. But reading it prepared me for like books that were more immersive and that had less exposition, books that you kind of get dropped in, as AP was talking about. You kind of get dropped in the middle, and you kind of gotta have to swim. So it's funny how some books can really tenderize you in a way for other books. So, and that really works. So I thank Steve for all that, because that helped.
That was all you, BL. Darius comment.
I can identify with Darius' comment.
Yeah, I got injured in my
I got
sleep.
injured in my sleep. Yeah, it's when you go into work or something. You go, oh, what happened to you?
Yes.
Were you exercising? It's like, no, I was pulling a t-shirt on and
Yeah, Darius right.
I stood up too quickly.
Yeah.
Like, what?
Yeah. How did I wake up with the pillow jammed into my eye? Why is my eye hurting? Because like all that stuff. There's our boss. There's the wonderful Beth Tabler, the head of Before We Go blog, and she's pretty well running everything now. Grimdark Magazine, Before We Go blog. She's fantastic.
How do you all get out of reading slumps? Was Elizabeth's question. Dave, how do you get out of a reading slump?
I just pick up a different book. I'm not a big DNFer, but if I'm having trouble, I'll just pick up a different book, and so I usually have a couple going at one time. I never used to do that, but I do it now just because otherwise I end up not reading.
Mm-hmm. It's very few books that I've DNF'd. There are a bunch of books that I have put on indefinite hold.
Yeah. Right.
Now, I was watching the your video, your recent video, AP, about expectations and what kind of expectations we have coming into a book. I was wondering, was there ever anything that you thought that you had low expectations of, and you thought, I don't think I'm going to like this, and you started reading it, and you said, I really like this, but I know I shouldn't. Has that ever happened to you? Like you had a book that you think you shouldn't like, but you do enjoy?
Well, there's never anything that I think I shouldn't like. There have certainly been a load of books that I have read that I went, that's not the typical thing that I enjoy. For instance, I would say that third person limited is possibly my favorite sort of narrative style for an author to use. Third person omniscient, the next one down. I think my least favorite, if someone was, can you tier rank these, would be first person. And of past tense and present tense, I prefer past tense, not present tense. But I've read first person narratives that I've absolutely loved. I've read first person present tense narrative that I have absolutely loved. The Short Timers, the book that Full Metal Jacket is based on, is first person present tense. And you go, I loved it. So there are some that occasionally I have preconceived notions of this is written in first person, I'm going to hate it. Oh, look, it's Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. But lo and behold, I have all of them because I loved the book. But if someone said, oh, do you like, well, I don't really like first. Well, I didn't like those ones. And the majority of books I like tend to be third person. But that's because the majority of the storytelling, it tends to fit that way. But when it comes to, I very rarely think I'm not going to like this book. And usually it is, I might, but one of the things that basically we got trained to do at university, it kind of got beaten into us by those sadistic lecturers, was even books that you sort of go, Dickens, oh God, Dickens is so boring and nothing happens. That because these lecturers taught us how to read and see different things within the text, suddenly something that, you wouldn't have picked up for fun. Oh, look, it's a 19th century economic novel. Oh, wow, this is going to be a thrill ride. But suddenly the language, the prose that they are using, their sentence construction, the characters that they have created, the beauty of the words on the page, the evocation of the time period, the political aspects that are woven all the way through it, the depictions of the culture. There's something there that starts arresting your attention. And you find yourself unwillingly kicking and screaming against, no, I've been told this is good literature and I should read it. And I'm enjoying it, and that's wrong. I want to read genre fiction. Let me back. But there are very few books. There are plenty of books that I've picked up and gone, I'll give it a go. And then gone, no, this is miserable. This is definitely not for me. And that's fine. We all have preferences. But there are very few books that I prejudge because I never know what it's going to be like until I read it, until I see what that author is doing and how they're trying to accomplish it. And so much of it is in that. It's not necessarily, people who use YA as a pejorative, absolutely ridiculous. There are some phenomenal YA books out there. One of my favorites is Junk by Burgess, and I think it has a different name in the States, but it is so poignant and harrowing. And it's a YA novel, and it's beautifully written, and it's accessibly written, and it's wonderful and dark because of its subject matter. But it's a YA book, and it's fantastic. So, but I don't read horror generally because they're scary, and I don't like it, and it gives me nightmares.
Do you read much? You don't read a whole lot of horror, do you, Jolien? No.
No, it's not safe for me either. It's I think that even if I would pick up a book, I'm probably not allowed because my husband knows that if I read a horror book or I watch a scary movie, he can't go out for the next month or so. So yeah, it's not a good idea.
And PL, do you read much horror?
I'm starting to read more and more. I'm blaming you, Steve, because I've been hanging out with you for so long that but by osmosis, it's seeping into my space. I read some really good. I've always loved Stephen King and of course Dean Koontz, but those are typically the only really horror writers that I've read for the most part. But I read great writer B.A. Bellick, The Pulse. We'd have BA on page chewing, and I'm about to read next month for Indie August 22 Dutch Road by T.C. Schuler, who was also on page chewing. And I hear it's a fantastic book, won a lot of indie awards. So I am slowly migrating more and more horror into my diet because I do find that it translates, some of the elements translate well to the darker fantasy stuff that I read. And especially you think about, I see maybe between the pages on there, Zamil Akhtar, the author of Gunmetal Gods, with his cosmic horror, Lovecraftian type stuff. I've read a lot of N.K. Jemisin, one of my favorite authors, who incorporates a lot of that stuff as well. So yeah, I'm P. DeJolly Clark. He's got some great fantasy horror stuff. Ring Shout, that's another one of my faves. And so yeah, I am getting more of a diet, more of a bit more of a chopping down on a bit more horror recently. So don't know if it become a thing, but it is starting to become more prevalent in my reading. So.
Are you a big King fan, Dave?
No, I have not read any King actually. So like I said, I'm not all that well read in any areas yet, but I have been reading obviously some horror. That's one of the genres that I've taken a liking to. But I haven't read any King. That's not true. I started to read the Gunslinger, and I thought I didn't like it. I put it aside. I have the first couple, and I'm going to get back to it. It was one of those ones. I had multiple ones going, and but I would say actually it's probably these transgressive horrors that I've been reading that would probably be my answer to that question of what are things that you think you shouldn't like that you like, because I've read a few of those, and I don't know. There's something you asked me 5 years ago. It's not something I would have been thought I was interested in, but I've been finding them kind of fascinating, some of these, and I feel a little guilty about reading them, like one, there was a couple last year that were like that. They were really bad, but I really enjoyed them because I think just because of the things that they explored, like through those really like just horrific situations, like one of the ones but probably one of my favorite books actually that I read last year was called The Resurrectionist. Had any of you read that book by James White? No, Rathby White. But that was a horrible book. I mean, in terms of the content, that was about a guy that had the ability to he could bring people back to life with no memory, no recent memory. So he could commit these horrible atrocities and kill people and then bring them back to life, and they would have no recollection of it. And so that story, revolved around a couple of individuals that, once they realized what was happening, and it was just like the book, it was so, the content was so horrible. It was like one of the worst things that I read. But it was fascinating the type of trauma that book explored. You had this like just incredibly unique form of trauma that these people were going through, of things that had happened to things that they knew that were happening to them and that they knew were going to happen to them, but they couldn't experience them. I mean, or they could only experience them in the instant. But at the time they're realizing that the trauma has happened and is going to happen, they have no understanding of what the trauma was like, of what it felt to go through that trauma. And I like, that was, it was just such a unique concept. I found it fascinating, but you could have only explored that concept in a book that, was kind of graphic about the experiences that those characters had. So it's just, so those are the types of things, like I get done reading them and I feel there's a couple of those in recent time, and where I feel like I got to take a shower after I'm done, and I feel like maybe I'm like a little embarrassed to say that I enjoyed the book, but if I'm honest, I really did. But
Have you read R. Scott Baker's Neuropath?
no.
That has to be one of the darkest, bleakest, most horrendous, horrible, disturbing books that I have ever read in my entire life. At the end of it, I wanted to wash my brain in bleach. It is an absolutely brilliant book. It's just not one I personally am ever going to read anytime soon. But it is it's a really good book. It's just incredibly dark and smart and exploring something really, really disturbing and exploring it in a smart way. But it's a really disturbing concept. And so, like R. Scott Baker's Neuropath.
I'm gonna write this down.
But yeah, I felt like I needed to bleach my brain afterwards just to try and clean it out. And one of the things that I love about literature, we can read literature just for the laughs or just for something to keep us entertained, that it's chewing gum for the eyes and it's not really engaging our brain, it's just fun. We can read literature that challenges us. We can read literature that teaches us. We can read literature that explores incredibly complex or difficult or traumatic or dark ideas, because it's in the book. It's in a safe area that we can close the pages on it to back away from it. We can use the literature as a psychic barrier to protect ourselves from the actual experience, to get an element of it, to try and gain understanding. And we can have books that use all of the same things all at once. Like, it's not just any one thing per book. That there are so many books, so many types of narrative, and across all genres. And I joke that I don't read horror. I've read not a lot in comparison to some of the other genres, but I've read a fair amount. Just typically it's not my go-to for entertainment, because that's not why I am reading. When I pick up a book for enjoyment, that is not the type of enjoyment I want. When I pick a film, I'm not picking one that has jump scares in it, because that's not the type of enjoyment I want. And so I pick books that I think are going to interest me in a certain direction. And what I often find is sometimes someone will suggest a book that I'd never considered reading, that is way outside what I thought that I was going to enjoy. And as soon as I start reading, I go, yeah, this is absolutely fantastic. Like reading Catch-22 for the first time. And, this is me sitting down. I love science fiction. I love fantasy. Reading Catch-22 and going, this is brilliant. And looking at the humor in it and going, this is really funny. And then understanding the darkness that underlies all of it and go, this is incredibly tragic. And that's all in one book. And literature reaches us in different ways. So when people say, oh, you shouldn't read that book, how do you know? How do you know what's going to speak to my soul? How do you know what's going to speak to me personally? That's going to create a resonance in my mind or remind me of a friend who died years ago or a family member. That there's something in that. It's going to spark that memory and connect with me in a way that is deeply personal, and I will get something from it. And it doesn't have to be the world's most well-crafted novel. But there has to be something to it that speaks to me. And that's great literature. Doesn't matter about genre. Doesn't matter about intended age range. It doesn't matter when it was published. Those things might all affect the probability of finding it. But there will always be those books that will speak to us individually with a power that is frightening to other people, because for some reason it strikes exactly the right chord. and we resonate with it. And that is why, like I always say to people, read widely, read outside. You have a preferred genre, read outside it, try different books. You like this sort of book, try books from different authors, different time periods, different genres. Because you can surprise yourself that you've boxed yourself into what you think you should be reading or what you like reading. You only like this one thing. And we box ourselves in. And we are the worst at confining our reading to something. And I think we need to let ourselves free to explore more out there. And I realize we're time poor. We don't have all the free time in the world. We don't have all the money in the world to buy all of the books that we want in the world. But there's something beautiful about being able to explore literature through the ages and reading poetry, reading 19th century poetry, 18th century poetry, reading plays, experiencing different forms of narrative. And as soon as you do that, other books open up to you because you've gotten used to new techniques, new ways of doing it. And suddenly they're not doing the thing they should. It's, oh, they're doing that thing. I recognize that thing. I know what they're doing. And suddenly a text that was indecipherable before just unfolds in front of you. And that's the beauty of reading.
Yeah, I agree. I used to only read books that when I was younger, I read books that I felt I could relate to, right? And then as I got older, I wanted to read books that with unlikable characters, people I couldn't relate to. I wanted that experience that would take me outside of my comfort zone, help me understand the world and interpret the world in different ways, learn, right? Grow, right? And I think now, for the most part, that's what I want. A book that's going to challenge me. I want a book that's going to, besides character work, because that's a must for me, I need a book with compelling themes. I need a book that I need to read that book and be touched to some degree inside. It doesn't have to be transformative. Just I need it to touch me on some elemental level, right? And I need compelling themes. And
On the doll, where did the book touch you?
Right here, AP. Nowhere else. Yeah, and I find though that, again, we talked about reading stumps, and Jolien, I'm hoping you get through your current stump. But then I need, as I spoke of before, then I need something that just may be fluffy and entertaining, and again, this whole trend towards, you have these palate cleansing books, and if you're a fantasy, then you take cozy fantasy, like something like that was talked about, the Legends and Lattes, and you wipe your brain clean of all this, dire, dark, things that are some of them are horrific, and the things that you wish you could unsee, but you don't want to see because it really affected you, and then you go right back into it, right? And that's the funniest thing about what I found about my reading recently, as what I consider hopefully a more mature reader, is that I like what I like, and I always stray back to what I like, but I do find, as AP said, that to break slumps, or because sometimes I just need a break, I jump out of genre or subgenre and I grab something totally different, or something that and I read it and it's great, and I'm refreshed and I'm enthused and reinvigorated, and then I dive back into the the dark and dreary, grim stuff that which I realize too, like that I write to a certain extent, right? And I think for me the biggest thing was I didn't understand that I was writing something so dark. In my mind, it wasn't dark when I wrote it. It was epic fantasy, it was high fantasy, and then until people start saying, "Ooh, this is really dark," and I'm like, "Really? Like, no, that's dark. Like, no, that's dark. Mine isn't dark. What are you talking about?" And that was a bit of an eye opener, and that was my first understanding that as an author, it was very humbling. As an author, obviously, I'm a pretty novice, fairly a novice author. That the book doesn't belong to you after you write it. It belongs to whoever buys it, and that is humbling, and that's something that it's hard to get used to at first. That while you take ownership of what you've written, the book belongs to the reader and the reader's unique interpretations of what they bring to the book, as AP said, and it doesn't belong to you anymore, right? Those characters that you wrote, someone sees them totally different. That way you wrote that thing that you thought was so clever. No, they didn't get it, or they saw something different over here that you didn't write that way, you didn't intend it that way, but and they teach you things about your own work, and it's humbling, right? But that's when as I get older, I'm finding that yeah, I tend to stray back to the same stuff, and I'm comfortable with that. But I do find also too, as I said, people like friends, Steve, who we do a lot of shows together, influencing my reader taste. I watch booktubers, the Joliens, the APs, the Daves, and they put something up. It's like, ooh, that looks interesting, and I'll just plug it on my TBR, and that's another thing that's changed for me too. That I think booktube specifically. 10 years ago, I would never dream of watching a book reviewer to see what they thought about, this book, and then make that affect my buying choices. Now it definitely does. So that's probably the biggest difference.
Beth is channeling me here. I also put it on indefinite hold. That hit a little close to home. Yeah.
You're not an It fan, I take it.
I've tried, and I'm just not a big fan.
Yeah.
There's a friend of mine who has done research on the representation of clowns and fun fairs and things like that in horror. We don't talk late at night.
Yeah.
It's just creepy.
Daniel had a comment. David Mitchell is always in present tense, and it always works really well. And I've quit reading a book because it's in present tense.
And that's an author. When an author chooses a perspective, because an author has a choice about how they are going to tell a story, and you hope that an author is actually considered. Is past tense going to be better than present tense? Is present tense going to be better than past tense? That they think about it because they have and can create different effects. Now, you can create the same effect, but you do it in different ways. But there's usually a reason you're going for one or the other. And then you go, do I want a first person? Because generally there's a view that with first person, you're trying to bring the reader in closer. Third person, you're trying to get that slight step back. But again, depending on how it's used, an author can achieve almost every single effect with first person that another author can do with third person, and vice versa. There are different ways of doing it. It's all about how they conceive of it and how they want to transmit it. And yet I will still say I don't like first person present tense, because the majority of first person present tense books I've read, I've gone, why couldn't you write this in third person past? But again, I've read ones that I really loved, and usually it's because the tense and the perspective match the narrative. They consolidate the narrative. They fit with the narrative, and they are seamless. That you go, yes, this is the perfect way to tell this story. Whereas other times you read it and you go, I think the author did this because they think this is how you're meant to tell a story, rather than thinking what was best for the narrative that they were actually telling. And, it's supposition on my part. I don't know them. But sometimes I feel that's why there can be a disconnect almost between the choice of perspective and the narrative, is that there's a feeling that it should be told in one way when it actually would fit better a different way.
Jolien and Dave, do you have a preference for perspective?
I usually like first person a lot, but that's because I love it when a character is telling you their life story. So that's usually first person past tense. Farseer, of course, and then Kashil is also in first person. I also love a coming of age story. So usually that's connected. I'm a big character driven reader, and especially I like to feel connected to the characters. I like to just feel everything that they're feeling as closely as possible. So, but there are some of my favorite books that are not in first person, so it's definitely not an absolute rule. But generally, if it's first person and if it's somebody telling me their life story, I'm usually going to like the book.
Yeah, I don't think it's something I've really thought about much. I mean, I don't think I really care. Actually, I don't think I have a particular preference for one.
But have you all read Interview with the Vampire, or did you see the film?
Yes, both.
Read the book.
Both.
And saw the film.
Yeah. Because when I first picked up Interview with the Vampire, I was like, what the hell is this? Because basically it's written in dialogue. And it's just written as someone telling you a story. And I'm going, oh, God, this is my eyes. Why are you doing this to me? And yet, you know, it's actually really well done. The dialogue flows like that. It is someone telling you a story. It's written as a transcript. But the trying to read it was difficult. And then the Vampire Lestat was much more like a traditional fantasy novel. It went back in time, was written in third person past tense, and suddenly I went, oh yeah, I'll read all of this. But it's the same author, the same world, a lot of the same characters, but those styles were so radically different that one was much more enjoyable for me to read than the other. And that's why I think things like this... Okay, disagree with me. I don't mind, but there's no need to shout. But that's why I think narrative perspective, the POV, the type of narration actually can have quite an impact on style and even on reception. And when something is written, like in Interview with the Vampire as dialogue, that's a completely different sentence structure and sentence pattern and rhythm to when it was written in a much more formal third person past tense. So it changes so much about it.
I want to I see Philip's commenting. I want to let Steve give that.
I'm in Canada with terrible internet at the moment, so I can't listen without lots of interruptions. But I wanted to say hello. Please try to behave, Professor Fireballs.
Right. Philip, once again, as a nefarious nemesis, is now maligning the good people of Canada.
Yes,
and complaining about their internet.
Yeah, we have great internet. We have great internet because we have monopolies. Okay, we have monopolies. There's Bell, there's Rogers and TELUS, but really, you only have so many choices, and we have great internet, right? Because we have huge internet monopoly companies. They dabble in all kinds of things, but we have great internet in Canada. Nary an interruption. I defend our internet, Philip. I'll have you know. So there you go.
And people never believe me when I say he's evil.
Evilness confirmed. Taylor said, Rona girls maybe want to scrub my skin off. Still remember that feeling after about 2 years. I haven't read that one.
No, I haven't read that one. Have you read, I'm trying to get Steve, folks, have you read Jolien or Dave or AP? Have you read Interview with the Vampire by
I have not.
by Jay Kristoff?
No.
Empire of the Vampire.
Empire of the Vampire, sorry, by Jay Kristoff. Yeah.
No, not yet. A couple of people have recommended it to me, so
highly recommend it.
At some point.
Highly recommend it.
Dr. Pops and Stuff, accurate neuropath review. I'm glad I read it because it was so good, but it was rough to have to read.
It is. I mean, if you like smart, intelligent, deeply disturbing books, because the concept that's being explored is truly frightening, because it's that dark and also possible. If you like that kind of book, like, it is a very compelling book, but it's like dark. It's like edgelord dark. It's like a guy dressed all in black, hiding in the shadows, going, I'm full of emotions. That kind of darkness.
That book is it's tough to find. I tried to buy it on Amazon. It was the paperback is like a few $100. I'm gonna have to find it used somewhere.
Oh wow, okay,
yeah.
I mean, you just got me into R. Scott Baker now, Steve. So now I'm determined to read it because I did love Darkness Becomes Before, but now, and I thought that was pretty dark, but this is sounding like a whole other level. So,
but Neuropath is set in the real world. At least Darkness That Comes Before, it's in a fantasy world. there is a huge gulf between our reality
Mm.
and what is happening in that book. Neuropath, you're going, that's happening next door.
Hmm.
That's one of the reasons why I think it is so compelling, and it lived with a rock on top of it in my bookcases for a while so that it couldn't escape and kill other books.
Don't forget the first part podcast PL next Friday.
Oh, is it next Friday?
Mhm.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right. That's on my calendar. That's I definitely want to be there for that. That's audio only, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It'll be fun.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
And Shady had a comment. I watch so much true crime. I'm not really shocked by things happening in horror books. Real life is far worse.
Yeah, I know a lot of authors who have written things that it seems prescient in terms of today's events. How my understanding is that Anna Smith Sparks says that the whole Prince of Nothing series is very, very prescient in terms of some of the things that it explores in terms of today's context. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the series. And obviously in my book, there's a lot of things. I've incorporated real life issues, how I see those issues into, or how I've seen those issues from my context, as a racialized person, and hopefully from somewhat of a historical context into my books. But do you folks ever think that something can be the way AP is describing that Baker book? It can be too real because it seems it is too real, it's too realistic, it's too close to home, it's too. Do you feel that way about books, or is it more that, oh no, that's good, so I can understand and interpret and analyze why the so and so and so is happening? It helps me make sense of the world. Like, so are certain things just too close to home?
Other people can talk before I. Please,
Too
I
close
don't
to
want my wife
home or
shouting
too
at me.
close to real life?
Too close to real life. Sorry, essentially, I should have clarified. Too close to real life.
Yeah, I mean, another one that I read last year that was really, really disturbing was Jack Ketchum's Girl Next Door, which was, based on real life story. I mean, there was minor differences, to some of the characters and things like that. But I don't know who's read that, but yeah, that one was based on a real life story, and so that was, I mean, again, absolutely, the activity that was taking place in that book was just absolutely atrocious. Things that were being visited upon that girl, and yeah, I mean, it was hard, very, very hard to read for that reason. I'm not sure I remember the question exactly anymore, PL. Was I answering it right?
Yeah, no, you did. You did an exceptional job. Just basically, can you read things that, because they are too representative of your current reality, or things that you've experienced, or how you see current events or past events? Like, is it too much for you to read? Is it too close to reality that it's just becomes almost abhorrent that you can't? It's not helping you. It's not therapeutic. It's not. You're not learning from it. It's just too much to absorb. Although it's realistic and it's well written and it's poignant, but it's just too.
Yeah, but there's a whole genre of different types of realist fiction, like true crime, historical fiction, and literary fiction, and slice of life, and all these different types of stories that are set in the real world. And depending on what the author is focusing on, and depending on your own life experiences, you can read something and you get to a passage and something happens and you put the book down because you get a flashback to that. You know exactly what that is because it happened to you. And you go, I don't want to be dealing with that now. I don't want to be reliving that memory now. And so you put the book down and you go, I'm not reading it. And it doesn't matter how good it is. And it doesn't matter that for other people reading it, it can be an incredibly important passage for them to understand that, because it didn't happen to them. But if it's happened to you and you read that, then it could even be in a fantasy book and something happened and it split second, you just let, and you, nope, done. That book gone. I am never like, and it's not because it's badly done. It's not because the author has handled something badly or has been insensitive, but there can be something in that moment, whatever is being depicted, that can set off one of your memories. And with realist fiction, I have a tendency to think that realist fiction does this more often than, say, science fiction or fantasy, because with at least science fiction and fantasy, we have that one step remove from the real. We have that distance because it's not the same. Whereas when someone is depicting something that is happening in our world, it seems that much closer. The separation between fiction and reality is thinner when you're reading realist fiction. It's still fiction, even dramatized events. You go, it might be based on the true events, but it's a dramatization of it. There are veneers of fictionality. But the closer you get to realism, the closer you get to that danger of, nope, this is too real for me. And sometimes we need to be confronted by certain things. Like we have seen traumatic images on TV, in news broadcasts about something. And for some reason, like we might have seen these news broadcasts day in, day out for whatever crisis, humanitarian crisis is happening. And then one day we're watching it and it hits us and we get it, we understand it. And you're in tears watching it. Because just in that moment, you finally made that point of connection. Now that can happen in a book. And because with a book, you are interpreting symbols on a page and giving them meaning. You're creating meaning. So it's inside your head. It's not something you can close your eyes to because you have constructed it. You've created it. You've been an active participant in creating this. And that makes it a very intimate act in some respects. And because of that, those things can then live rent-free inside our brains far more than, say, something we just saw on the screen. And so I think there can be a power to fiction that can be traumatic and remind us of traumatic events or sad events, people who have passed on from our lives. And we read something, we read a line and we go, that, and you trigger a memory. And those things can be very difficult to deal with. And no author can anticipate it. No author can predict the lives of everyone who is going to read their book. But there have certainly been books that I have set aside, at least for a while, because of reading something and gone, no, this is not the time for me to be reading that.
What about you, Jolien? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that Dave made a great distinction about hitting too close to home or to real life. Like if it really has a personal effect on me, there are a couple of things that I just can't read about. And at this point, I can, if it's just mentioned, it's fine. But if it really goes into it deeper, I just have to put the book down. So that's also why I actually like trigger warnings. I know a lot of people don't like them, but it's something that's optional. You don't have to read it if you don't like it. But for people who do find that important, it's nice if it's there. Things that hit too close to like real life, I don't really mind it, but it's also not a way for me to understand real life better, if that makes sense. I would then much rather read nonfiction or just look it up on the internet than see it in a fictional world, because then for me there's kind of like a disconnect. I will read it, I will maybe enjoy the story, but I will not make the connection with real life.
But have you ever felt catharsis from reading something? You have read something and it has moved you and has been a cathartic release. You know, I've experienced that and gone, yeah, I was reading a fantasy novel and something happens and you cry, and it helps you release tension that you didn't know that you were holding in, and you can have a cathartic release, or it can help you work through a particular issue. I've experienced both those things. So I'm not saying that always avoid it, but I'm just saying that I understand the range of emotions, and I'm a supporter of trigger warnings. I don't see a problem with having trigger warnings in books, because you go, if you don't want to read a trigger warning, it's going to be in the publishing material bit that people skip over anyway, unless they're weirdos like me who look down the publishing material. And so if you don't care about it, you flip past it. What's the big deal? And for people who want it, they know to look for it and go, oh, right, yeah. And it hasn't hurt anyone. The people who need it can find it. The people who don't care about it don't have to look at it. It's a win-win.
Yeah. I didn't put a trigger warning for my first book. I did for my second, just because of feedback that, some of the content. And I'm thinking about AP's comment about catharsis. Yeah. For example, To Ride Hell's Chasm by Jenny Wirtz. That was a book that for me, it was cathartic. It was moving. I cried. It was, it was something that really touched me, and helped me make sense of certain things that at the time I was grappling with, right? And but those reads, the thing with those reads is obviously they stick with you. Those are books you always remember, no matter how old you are, and and for me, those for me are the best books, but for someone else, and maybe the book that was just, again, it was something that, you breezed through, it was enjoyable, you barely remember the characters, but it was fun, you needed it right then and there, and it was a blast, and so it just depends on, I guess, the person. But what about you, Steve? How do you feel about that?
If I'm gonna read, like, I can't read The Girl Next Door because it's too close to the real events, so I have to know that I'm reading like a true crime story than to read that one. But if I know what I'm getting into, then I'm okay with it. I'd rather, but I think what Jolien said is pretty close, is that I'd rather read the actual events and find out about it that way. The one exception is, I think, the Poppy War. I did enjoy that one, so I was going to ask Jolien about that, what she thought about the Poppy War and the real events.
I just was thinking about that one as well when you said it, and I think that was even though I really liked how she incorporated it, at the same time, it could have been a completely fictional event, and for me, it would have done the same thing, probably. But I enjoyed it, I think is maybe the correct word to say, because I started looking up real life events. So maybe in that sense, it has opened up part of my understanding better, but the book in itself didn't really make a difference for me if it was a real fictional event or if it was based on true life.
Interesting question, though. Jonathan had a comment. Like I said, some people like to trauma bond with the characters. I mean, Lifetime Channel formed an entire network around that concept. Brenda, comment on the flip side of that, I've read books that touched on some traumatic experiences from my past, and I absolutely agree with AP. It was extremely cathartic for me.
And that, I think, that's part of it. Sometimes when we get to those sections, we're not in the position that it is going to be cathartic, and it's unpleasant. You don't want to do it. Other times it can be cathartic, but that's always up to the individual. And then other people, it won't touch either of those aspects. It'll just be, oh, this is just part of the world, and I'm interested to find out what happens next. Reading, individual readers, you can't predict it. And certainly there are the Malazan Book of the Fallen, other fantasy series that depict very harrowing acts at various points. And personally, I think that Erikson tries very, very hard and succeeds the vast majority of the time to depict them with sympathy and nuance. And yet, I know some readers will look at it and go, nope, not reading that. done. That is terrible. That is awful. How can that author have ever included that? And you go, because that reader does not want to read that. And no matter how sympathetically it was portrayed, it is never going to work for them. And they shouldn't be forced to read it. But for other readers, and I know other readers have responded and said, because of how those certain things were portrayed in that book, in one of Erickson's novels, that really helped them. And you go, so you can have those two extremes from the same event in the same book by the same author. People have written to him to express distaste at it, and people have written to him to thank him for it because it really helped them. And you go, an author can't predict that. There's a whole range of possibilities out there. And I bet you there's a whole swathe of readers who read that section, went straight past it and go, hang on, where was this section that was so controversial that AP's talking about, that there were these two different responses? Their eye might have gone right over it because for them, that wasn't the thing. So that's why stuff like this, we can talk about general responses. We can talk about the responsibility of an author. We can talk about the responsibility of a reader. And we can talk about all of these general big concepts. And there will always be exceptions to it. And it's never going to cover every single eventuality. And it's never going to cover every single topic. And people like to be scared. People like to be challenged. That's why horror exists. That's why all of those dark books exist. Other people don't like that, which is why lighthearted comedies exist. There is room and scope for all, and it is just going to depend. Although I don't know what the Lifetime channel is.
No idea.
Oh, who wants to take this one? The Lifetime channel is a like a how would you describe this without getting in trouble? It is it's a channel that has lots of sappy romance and like rom-coms and things like that. I guess, is that a fair description?
Yeah, that's a fair description. I mean, you could literally, you wouldn't need to know the plot of each. The plot's all the same. You just have different characters, and it's, there's different channels where, essentially, it's essentially the same story. The setting is different, the characters are different, but you could predict the story from start to finish entirely without any deviation. Like you would, But it's very popular. And again, it's that light, entertaining. I guess and especially if it's romance. I mean, I love romance, so I'm not trashing romance here. I'm just saying that pretty predictable plots, pretty, shall we say, consistent storylines. There's a lot of fake snow, and it's like where the actual locations are is probably 40 degrees plus, but you see the fake snow coming now. But yeah, I mean it's light, Hallmark, chatty, Hallmark movies, that sort of thing, like the old Harlequin romances,
Right, okay.
Kind of, just boy meets girl, boy and girl have an issue, they break up, they get back together and live happily ever after. That's
the third act breakup.
It's, if you like that predictability, then that's your that's your channel.
Yeah. Taylor says, reading is a really intimate act, so predicting how someone is going to respond is nigh impossible. You never know. Everyone's a little different. Lifetime also made for some TV versions of Real Crime. Yeah, they do take some real life stories and twist them around a little bit.
Yeah, there was a time where victim characters, bad unsolved mysteries. Yeah, there was a time where, because of my work, I immersed myself in police procedurals, thrillers, crime books, all that stuff. And then because of my work, and then because of my work, it got to the point where I didn't want to read that stuff at all anywhere. I wanted to go nowhere near it. I didn't want to see it on the shelf. And sometimes I feel, we go through these phases in our life where our reading tastes change, or they evolve, or however you'd like to put it. But do you feel that your reading tastes are evolving over time? That you're what you're choosing to read is it's going off into ways that perhaps you never thought, directions perhaps you never thought you'd read. Like, do you feel your reading tastes are, or do you feel you're pretty well staying, somewhat consistent with what you read? And I know we're all essentially fantasy horror readers, but still, do you feel that you're diversifying your reading more as you you progress, or you like?
Well, when I was younger, I had more time. When I was at university, or when I was in high school and university, I had more time to read, and I had more time off where I could read more. And then because of various other things, suddenly the amount of free time I had was less. But I was greatly privileged because part of my university education was reading. And so I got to experience a huge amount. But I went through reading books from different genres, because I read a whole load of legal thrillers. I had read a load of police procedurals. I read a load of, I didn't read a load of true crime, because not my thing. But I read a couple. I read a few. My dad used to love detective stories and murder mysteries, and so there was a bunch of those in the house that I read those. My brothers, because I had elder brothers, they had a whole bunch of horror books that I read and science fiction books that I read, and then I studied the stuff, and I got a chance. My sister had a whole collection of things like Sweet Valley High that, I read a bunch of those just to see what they were. I read a lot just to read, to experience different stories. And okay, some of them was going, yeah, this is rubbish, and it was you were just okay, I'm done. But I had time to read. These days, because my time is more limited, I am probably pickier about what I read for fun. I have things that I read for my channel, because I am now doing this as a hobby. So that is a work commitment in terms of, I'm reading that thing and I'm going to read that thing. That is work. I have work commitments in terms of editing, which involves reading, that I don't talk about on the channel, but those are all work commitments. And so the amount of time that I have for pleasure reading gets less and less and less, because I have work commitments. And then I have other commitments during the day when you're doing other work. And you go, right, but I have to keep a roof over my head, because that YouTube ad money of £1.27, whoa, that's going to keep me in light bulbs. So I'm probably pickier, but I like to think that at least I've experienced other things. And then if someone says, try reading this thing, and you go, well, okay, I'll give it a go, because it's come highly recommended, and they only then recommend really interesting books from genres outside of fantasy to me, because they know I have a lack of time to do these things. So unless it is something that they feel really passionately about, that this is an incredible book, AP, you really need to read it, then so that's kind of my approach. My tastes have changed. Books I liked when I was 11 years old, I don't like now. Books I liked when I was 16, I can see why I liked them when I was 16, but I certainly wouldn't put them in my top 100 books of all time. Books that I hated when I was younger, I pick up now and go, how could I have ever hated this book? This is brilliant.
What about you, David and Jolien? What have your reading taste or your habits changed?
Well, for me, I haven't been reading for that long of a time. I think that after a very long hiatus, I probably picked it up in the beginning of 2020. So over 2 years' time, it hasn't really changed that much. I started with adult fantasy. I'm still reading adult fantasy, and it kind of almost makes me a little bit nervous because the first series that I actually read was a little bit before the TV show came out of Game of Thrones. So I think that that's what 10 to 15 years ago at this point. So I read A Song of Ice and Fire then, and it's still my number one book series of all time, but I haven't read it since then. So I actually don't know because I don't do a lot of rereads, but I am going to reread it next year. And I really hope that I still like it as much as I did then. Because that's definitely not first person, very close to one of the characters. It's completely different than what I usually gravitate towards now. So it will be interesting to see how it changed.
Yeah, I guess we're pretty similar. I mean, when I was really young, I used to hate reading, and then as I got older, I've always been a slow reader, and life's busy, and I didn't start reading really in earnest until recent years, and so I'm still learning. What I'm playing in the genres I like. You'd be amazed at what I haven't. I love fantasy, but you'd be amazed at all the series that I haven't read yet. Sci-fi, horror, fantasy, these ones that I like. I'm still doing so much catch up, and so I'm still learning. I've learned I like transgressive fiction, right? And I'm learning that I like, even though I have those preferred genres, I keep trying other things. I specifically try to be. I'm not very well read at this point, but I try to be widely read. And there's actually a booktuber that I watch. When I first started watching booktube, I watch some of those big channels, I think, as we all do. And then we get in the community, and then a lot of us start to watch a lot of smaller channels, maybe not so many of the huge ones anymore. But one channel that I have continued to watch since the very beginning is a Savage Reads. He's a UK reviewer, right? Simon? Jolien looks like she knows who I'm talking about.
He doesn't read what I like, so
Yeah.
I don't really know the books, but he's a nice person.
That's exactly why I watch him. Because he gives me exposure in two ways that I don't get from any of the other booktubers that I watch. Is those genres that I just said are my preferred genres, those are the only ones that he doesn't read, right? He reads like everything else. And he's introduces me to books that are coming out of the UK, some of which I wouldn't see over here, And I've read like some things in stuff that I did not think at all that, like, if you describe them to me, I wouldn't think at all I'd be interested in them. But listening to him talk about them, he sold them good, and I tried them, and some of these are like some of my favorite books. I love these books. I read last year, I read a couple for that he had recommended that were so not my wheelhouse. One was called I Am an Island. I don't know if everybody's heard of that book by Tamsin Kalidas. It's a memoir about a woman that was trying to take care of a croft on a Scottish isle, and ended up going through all sorts of different trauma, and she was ended up being like an outcast on the island. Husband left her, was destitute, all this sort of stuff happened, but she was a beautiful writer. I absolutely loved that book. I love that. But it's not something I would have gotten in the bookstore and picked up, just unique thing. He recommended another book. What was it called? Oh, here is the Beehive, or Here Comes the Beehive. And it was a book about like a broken marriage that was told in verse. And it was just, again, not something I would have picked up in the bookstore, but I just am constantly finding these things that I think are outside of my wheelhouse that I'm enjoying. So in some ways, I still feel like my reading career is kind of young, and I'm continue to find things all sorts of different things that I'm interested in.
I know it's getting late for Jolien and for AP. Don't want to keep you too long because you're on the other side of the world, and I know it's the middle of the night for both of you, so don't want to keep you too long. But it's always a pleasure to have all of you together.
Thank you very much. Have you noticed that I've been slowly drooping?
Yes. I can tell, yeah. I can
I am very sorry. I was going to say that actually, because it's after 2 for me, and I'm really sorry. I am going to have to go.
yeah.
But thank you so much. It has been an absolute pleasure. And again, I'm very sorry if I talk over people. I honestly don't mean to, and I always want to hear other people's points of view. And I am very, very sorry that I talk too much. But thank you so much for having me on for the discussion.
Of course, anytime.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, this has been great. This has been great.
Mhm.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Steve, for having us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Appreciate
Thanks
it.
everyone for coming by. Of course, thanks everyone for coming by in the chat. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
It's a great way to start the weekend. So we will catch everyone soon.
Have a good night. Get